Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, we will now proceed with the review of the Lao People's Democratic Republic. In accordance with Resolution 5/1, the review is based on the national report, the compilation of UN information, and the summary of stakeholders' information, both prepared by the OHCHR. I now have the honor to give the floor to His Excellency Mr. Bungket Sangsomsak, Minister to the Prime Minister's Office, Chairman of the National Committee on Human Rights of the Lao People's Democratic Republic, to introduce the report. Your Excellency, welcome. You have the floor.
Thank you, Mr. President. Thank you for the kind words, and thank you for the warm welcome. I met you briefly behind this room. We know you are professional diplomat, and we're going to share the meeting together for the performance of excellent outcome for this meeting. I thank you once again. Mr. President, Excellencies, distinguished delegate, I'm greatly honored to lead a highly Lao delegation to attend this 35th session of the UPR Working Group. On behalf of my delegation, I would like to express my deep thanks for the kind words once again to Mr. President addressed to me for this meeting. I am confident that this meeting under your chairmanship, with the rich experiences and your wisdom, the meeting will be very successful without discrimination, through encouragement and constructive discussion. The Lao PDR participation to this third cycle UPR is not only a national obligation, but also to join hands with the international community on improving of human rights situation. Furthermore, UPR should not be, as my very personal opinion, Mr. Chairman, UPR should not be limited to the role of providing only important recommendations, but also UPR should be the platform, a mandated role that ensure UPR recommendation be complemented to the project implementation supported by the UN and other partners. On this note, UPR has to come to connect human rights with development by ensuring the goal of human rights to be channeled to the objective of development. Mr. Chairman, I think you and me met just a few minutes ago. You don't know my country as I don't know your country. But today I will report to you that my country, my nation, has 6,000 years of existence. But 400 years among them, the Lao people have been denied the basic right, dignity, freedom, liberty, and equality just because we have been under foreign occupation for nearly 400 years. Fortunately, the establishment of the Lao People's Democratic Republic on 2nd December 1995 opened a new era of national independence and ownership of the people of their own country, giving Lao people to be master of the country who have been chosen their own political system, which is the most suitable to the historical, social, and cultural reality of the Lao nation, as well as reflects the deep responsive to the political will and aspiration of the Lao people. With this establishment of the Lao People's Democratic Republic, the Lao people will become the master of their own destiny, appreciate the ownership right of the new society in the Lao nation, and will enjoy its basic right of freedom, equality, fairness, and state of Laos will ensure the development of the Lao citizen. I am pleased, Mr. Chairman, to notify that over the past 5 years, the Lao PDR continued to enjoy political stability, social order, with this crucial factor that facilitate the national socio-economic development, maintaining a steadily high economic growth rate with an average of 6.5% per annum. The living condition of the Lao people has been gradually enhanced and improved, leading to the enjoyment in the right. The government is in the process of formulating the 9 5-year National Social Economic Development Plan for 2020-2025 by integrating indicators from the effort to set strength while also cooperating with all friendly nations around the world, including international organizations and other stakeholders, to further contribute to the successful implementation of its 5 years National Social Economic Development Plan. In this, bringing a nation out of poverty and least developed country status by 2024. Mr. President, the promotion and protection of human rights are also at the heart of the government of Laos. The year 2015, amendment of the Lao Constitution acknowledges, respects, protects, and guarantees the human right and fundamental right of each citizen in accordance with the law. Right, freedom, and obligation of Lao citizens in various fields, including political, economic, social, and cultural fields, are enshrined in the Constitution of the Lao PDR, in line with the human rights treaties that Lao PDR is party to. These principles have been further developed in detail into hundreds of human rights related documents and regulations to further ensure full enjoyment of those human rights by the people. Mr. President, the Lao PDR National Report for the third cycle of PR was the compilation of the basic information from all relevant sectors of government, mass organizations, legislative organizations, and judicial organizations through consultation process, and included the contribution from the civil society organizations, academic institutions, UN agencies, development partners, and NGO in the LAPR. The content and substance reflect the achievement and progress of the successful implementation of 116 recommendations. I underline 116 recommendations that we have supported in our second cycle review, which have been attained satisfactory, visible, and concrete achievement. Since the second cycle of UPR, the Lao government has taken legislative and policy action to improve the country's good governance, to deepen the reform of judicial system, graduate people from poverty, prepare the country to graduate from underdevelopment, narrow the development gap, ensure social justice, and guarantee the enjoyment to this basic right. It's right of freedom, liberty, equality, in the development of the country by the Lao people. In pursuing foreign policy of openness and international cooperation, the Lao PDR has become a state party to almost all human rights instruments. I underline, Laos has been party on almost International Covenant on Human Rights, exactly 7 out of 9. On this occasion, the Lao PDR has holding bilateral human rights dialogue with Australia, with the EU, European Union, and is working closely with ASEAN Intergovernmental Commission on Human Rights. On this note, Mr. Chairman, I would like to highlight that Laos now enjoy with Australia in the European Union very mutual interest, constructive and fruitful high policy level engagement on human rights. Mr. President, I would like now to take this opportunity to highlight some of the achievements in the sector that have had high success rate of implementation as follows. On fulfillment of LAPDR obligations under human rights treaties, LAPDR has committed its initial national report on the CRPD in 2016, the initial national report under ICCPR in 2017. Myself, I was in this building to present such a report. The combined 8 and 9 periodic national report under the CEDAW, the combined 6 to 6 periodic national report under CRC, and lastly the initial national report under 2 optional protocol of the CRC. LAPDR has invited and received visit from the UN Special Rapporteur on the sale of children, prostitution and pornography of children in 2017, and the Special Rapporteur on human rights in extreme poverty in 2019. On this note, Mr. Chairman, as I mentioned to you in our meeting, I extend my formal invitation to you to visit Laos before the next round of GPR in Geneva. I hope you will accept my invitation. On development rule of law, over the past 5 years, the government has continued to implement its legal sector master plan for 2020 that was adopted in 2010 with emphasis on improving the justice sector, governance in public administration toward more transparency, efficiency and productivity, strengthening the prevention and combating the corruption. We all of this will make LAPDR being the rule of law state by 2020. To further promote and create more facilitating conditions for the people who have better and wider access to justice, in 2017, the government has adopted the decree on legal aid and the decree on legal aid fund for the disadvantaged people. Up to now, Mr. President, there are 15 legal aid offices across the country which has significantly increased access to justice. You see, the number is only 15. For those big country, 15 is a quite small number. But for Laos, with only 6 million people, 16 offices is very big number to other country. Mr. President, on civil and political rights, right to freedom and religion. The Constitution of LAPDR guarantees the right and freedom of citizens to believe or not to believe in religion. We have amended the Decree number 92 on management and protection on religion activities and adopted the Decree number 315 in 2026 with the aim to better facilitating the lawful religious activities of Lao citizens. Now on right to freedom of expression in peaceful assembly. LAPDR has open and supportive policy for all people to express their opinion in peaceful assembly, to conduct researches and publication that are not contrary to the law. These rights are guaranteed in the Constitution and further provisional in detail through the law adopted by the Assembly. For instance, the law on mass media in 2017, which stipulated that Lao citizens had the freedom to express their opinion through mass media platform in creative manner or other media, and had the freedom to access online social media. In present days, Mr. Chairman, Lao citizens has better and wider access to internet, to social media, with many beneficial uses. At the same time, the government also pay attention for restricting the abuses of online social media to spread fake news, disinformation, and pornography material, among others, that have led to social confusion and degradation. On the right of freedom of association, the Lao government considers the non-profit association and foundation as well as international non-governmental organizations as important partner for social economic development and poverty alleviation. Thus, the Lao government has adopted a number of legal measures. For instance, the Decree on Association and Foundation number 238 created a handbook on the work of association, pamphlet on how to establish and register an association foundation in a friendly format. At the moment, there are 163 associations. I repeat, there are 163 associations and 25 foundations that has been approved by relevant authority. For those who are not been in Laos, 160 look very small number. But I told you, Laos is a small country with 6 million people. 163 associations means a great deal for Laos as a country. The Lao government expressed concern relating to the disappearance of the Lao citizen. With regard to the 4 recommendations accepted by the Lao PDR from PDR 2nd, PDR 2nd concerning the disappearance case, the government of Lao PDR assured that it has not ceased its effort to continue the ongoing investigation to bring the case to the conclusion according to the law and as requested by the family. However, many questions remain unclear. The established investigation committee is continuing to look into all aspects that may deliver further clarity to the cause of disappearance. On anti-trafficking in person, Lao PDR considers human trafficking as violation of the most fundamental right of its citizens, and it is a very critical offense as provided for by the law in the law on anti-human trafficking at 2016. In the Penal Code of 2017, the Lao government actively focused on combating and suppressing human trafficking as well as victim rescue effort. It has also bilaterally cooperated with its neighbor country while also cooperated multilaterally at sub-regional, regional level and with international organizations on combating and suppressing human trafficking, which include preventive measures and victim assistance. Mr. President, now I turn to economic and social cultural rights. Lao PDR considers poverty reduction as one top priority in socio-economic development for aim at graduating from the LDC status by 2034 in achieving the SDG in order to steadily improve the livelihood of its people. The government has adopted in 2030 a vision, Strategic Rural Development in Poverty Eradication Plan 2016-2025. In the last one, the Strategic Development Plan for 2030, National Green Growth Strategy for 2030, and incorporated them into the 8 5-year National Socio-Economic Development Plan, with a view to elevating the Lao people to the middle-income country. According to UNTAC assessment, it is highly probable that the Lao PDR will be able to graduate from LDC by 2024. The Lao PDR considers education as another priority in its socio-economic and cultural development. It has adopted and amended many legislation relating to education sector, such as Law on Education 2015, Decree on High Level of Education 2015, Decree on Monastery Education in 2017. The Lao PDR is implementing its education and sport development plan for 2016-2020 and Vision on Education 2030, as the government has tried to allocate, Mr. Chairman, 17% of its GDP into education sector annually. Since the second cycle of the PR, the government has continued to reform the public health sector in order to provide Lao multi-ethnic people with wide and accessible health care coverage through its bill care policy. The implementation of the Health Reform Plan 2016-2020 is ongoing, as well as the National Nutrition Strategy for 2015 and the National Nutrition Plan 2016-2020. At the same time, the government has focused on improving the infrastructure and expanding in public health network in urban and rural area. The Lao PDR reiterates that land. I emphasize again, the Lao PDR reiterate that land is national treasure under ownership of the all Lao multi-ethnic people, with the state administer the land on behalf of the people in a collective and uniform manner. The state upholds its target of sustainable land use with 70% forest fund. Actually, it should be 73%. 90% agricultural land, of which no more than 2 million hectares is allowed for rice paddy field. And the rest of 11% from the total land is for housing and for other use of land. The state acknowledges and protects the right to land ownership for irrigated land and has adopted a decree 84/PM on land compensation in the settlement of people affected by the development project 2016 and to provide fair compensation on land replacement. So, Mr. President, in 2018, provide fair compensation in land replacement. Again, in 2018, the National Assembly adopted a law on settlement and sustainable job allocation, and then in 2019, it has also adopted the law of land. On protection specific group, the promotion of gender equality and elimination of discrimination against women, it considered to have made much progress. Both Lao women and men have equal rights in the political, economic, social, cultural, and family affairs as provided for the Constitution. The National Assembly has adopted the law on gender equality in 2019. The Lao PDR attaches importance to the protection of the right in the best interest of children, reflecting its policy, one-child development, legislative measure, a national mechanism for protection of the right of the child right and interest. It has created a national work plan for protection against and elimination of violence against women and children, National Action Plan for Mothers and Child, National Action Plan for elimination of all privilege and other things for women. Mr. Chairman, despite Laos has made endeavor and progress in the area of promoting and protecting the right of person with disability, Lao PDR ratified to the Convention on the Right of Person with Disability on 25 September 2009. In 2019, it has adopted a law on persons with disability in 2019 and strengthened protection of rights in the interest of persons with disability. Eliminate all forms of discrimination against persons with disability, providing them with enabling conditions for self-development, salaries, and access to social activities. Latvia is composed of 50 ethnic groups. I repeat, Laos is composed of 50 ethnic groups living together in peace and harmony across the country. All ethnic groups are equal before the law, and all ethnic groups have a duty in contributing toward national safeguarding and development. In law and in practice, Latvia prohibits all act or racial discrimination and ethnic division or discrimination. Despite the significant achievement made, there remain many challenges and difficulties in certain areas. So I would like to brief to you, Mr. President, our difficulties. In strengthening the rule of law, there is the need for promoting a better understanding of the law among the law enforcement officers, government officials, judicial officials, and the general public, so that all the society be able to implement the law effectively and fully ensure social justice. Addressing the lack of sufficient resources for further in socio-economic development to achieve LDC graduation target and further promote the full enjoyment of economic, social, and cultural rights by the Lao ethnic people. The third difficulty is addressing the impact of UXO in the war remaining a high hinder and obstruct the national socio-economic development and negatively impact the livelihood of the people in the remote area who have been suffering loss in life, well-being, and property, and having many them with disability. Mr. President, as you know, we still have annual victims from GXO. Before it was 400 to 500 victims, women and children, but now reduced to some hundred. But we would like to hear from distinguished organizations like this, a word, a voice, or sympathy, or encouragement, because they are victims of human rights violation. But we keep quiet on this. So please give us some encouragement to help these children, these women, victims of the EXO. I will be very grateful to our distinguished delegate here to come one day to assist Laos to get out from this killing innocent people. Mr. President, I have highlighted some of the achievements of the Lao people, Laos People Republic has made over the past 5 years in implementation of recommendation accepted by the second cycle of GPR. It has mastered all of strength and available resources in national endeavor, with assistance and cooperation of international community. At the same time, I have been faced with a similar challenge and difficulty in this endeavor. Therefore, I sincerely hope that from the third cycle review, we will receive constructive, objective, appropriate and sincere recommendation from fellow UN members to help Laos to overcome the challenge and progress further in national development and promotion and protection of human rights. In conclusion, Mr. President, as the head of the delegation, I would like once again to express my deep appreciation and thanks to you as you chair this meeting. And we are ready as Lao delegation to respond any question, any inquiry, anything that our distinguished delegation Excellency would like to answer from the floor, and we are respond you with open heart. I thank you, Mr. Chairman.
I thank you, His Excellency, Mr. Bungket Sangsomsak, for this statement. We shall now begin our interactive dialogue. Before giving the floor to the delegations for their questions and comments, I would like to remind you that the speaking time will be 1 minute 15 seconds for all. Please be reminded that the use of the words recommend or recommendation will ensure that the relevant parts of your statements are included in the recommendations section of the working group report. I will now refer to the list of speakers. First on my list is Cuba. Cuba, you have the floor.
Thank you, President. We'd like to extend a warm welcome to the delegation from Laos PDR and thank them for the presentation of a wide-ranging national report. We highlight the commitment to the mechanism, efforts deployed to implement recommendations accepted during the prior review, particularly progress made in the area of education, health and relieving poverty. We recommend the following. 1. To continue adopting tangible actions to eliminate poverty and improve the living standards of your people. 2. Strengthen measures to improve the quality and the range of your education system, particularly in the remote areas. 3. To continue implementing policies to improve access and the quality of public health services, emphasizing reducing child mortality and working in the rural areas. And we'd very much like to wish you every success in your review.
Thank you very much. Next speaker is Cyprus.
Thank you, Mr. President. Cyprus welcomes the participation of the delegation from the Lao People's Democratic Republic at today's UPR, as well as the presentation of its report. Cyprus notes the progress made by Laos since its last review, including the adoption of the Strategic Development Plan for 2016-2025, the integration of the SDGs into the country's planning framework, as well as a reduction in illiteracy. Cyprus would like to recommend, firstly, ratify the second optional protocol to the ICCPR and the optional protocol to the Convention Against Torture. Second, issue a standing invitation to all special procedures of the Human Rights Council. Third, ensure the right to freedom of expression. Fourth, take steps with a view of prohibiting early and forced marriage. And lastly, take immediate actions to criminalize the sexual exploitation, abuse and sale of children. Thank you.
Thank you. Next speaker is Czech Republic.
Thank you, Mr. President. The Czech Republic welcomes the delegation of Lao People's Democratic Republic. The Czech Republic feels encouraged by a series of steps undertaken by the government that improve the legal framework related to children's rights and youth, including the adoption of the National Strategy for Mothers and Children. We applaud the government for measures taken to improve the access to education as well as the enrollment rates among girls. We also note with appreciation that the Lao government reduced the scope of offenses punishable by death penalty from 18 to 12. We would like to offer following recommendations. First, maintain the moratorium on executions and abolish the death penalty. 2. Ensure full enjoyment of the freedom of expression, association and peaceful assembly, and progress to fully investigate all allegations of arbitrary arrests, enforced disappearances, and criminal convictions for expression of political opposition or criticism of state policies. 3. Take effective measures to safeguard the independence and impartiality of the judiciary. And 4. Take steps against trafficking in persons and related labor and sexual exploitation, with special emphasis on child victims, women, and members of ethnic minorities. Thank you.
Thank you. Next speaker is Democratic People's Republic of Korea.
Thank you, Mr. Vice President. The DPRK delegation warmly welcomed the high-level delegation of Lao PDR and notes with appreciation for its third national report and excellent information. We highly commend the Lao government for its strong efforts and tangible progress in promotion and protection of human rights through the adoption and implementation of a 10-year strategic development plan for 2016-2025. My delegation wishes the Lao government great success in its future endeavor for the promotion and protection of human rights of its people and recommend the following. 1. To accelerate efforts to achieve economic growth aimed to raising the living standard of all people, including those living in remote areas. 2. To continue its efforts to create favorable conditions for ensuring access to free and quality education for all children. 3. To continue its efforts to improve the implementation of its policies on public health and develop the healthcare infrastructure in remote areas. We wish Lao PDR successful review. I thank you.
Thank you. Next speaker is Denmark.
Mr. Vice President, Denmark welcomes the delegation of the Lao People's Democratic Republic and thanks it for its presentation here today. We commend progress made by Lao PDR in strengthening the legal and policy framework related to children's rights. However, significant challenges remain. Denmark recommends the government to adopt legislative measures to ensure that all forms of sexual abuse, exploitation and sale of children are prohibited and criminalized. The protection and promotion of human rights and fundamental freedoms for all is at the heart of the 2030 agenda and is indispensable in the pursuit of sustainable development. Denmark recommends the government to guarantee the peaceful exercise of the right to freedom and expression by revisiting relevant legislation, including Article 65 of the Criminal Code. Finally, Denmark recommends the government to ratify the optional protocol to the Convention Against Torture. Denmark wishes Lao PDR a successful review. I thank you.
Thank you. Next speaker is Dominican Republic.
Thank you, Vice President. The Dominican Republic would like to welcome the distinguished delegation of Lao PDR. We recommend respectfully the following. First, that you continue to consolidate national mechanisms that enable greater participation and equality for women, as well as promoting and protecting the rights and well-being of women and girls. Two, that you continue to implement measures and programs to improve prison conditions and guarantee the rights of those persons deprived of their freedom. Three, that you continue to strengthen actions to implement and monitor those recommendations accepted in the UPR, and also to establish a mechanism to link this up to Agenda 2030. And finally, the Dominican Republic welcomes the approval of those laws which are aimed to facilitating, as far as they can, the approval processes for registration as well as the activities of NGOs. And we would like to wish Lao PDR a very successful UPR. Many thanks.
Thank you. Next speaker is Croatia.
Mr. Vice President, Croatia welcomes the delegation of Laos and wishes to thank them for the presentation of their report. We commend the progress made regarding the harmonization of the national legislation in line with international standards and positive steps taken towards establishing a rule of law. However, more efforts are needed to address the issue of ensuring the enjoyment of equal human rights to all segments of society. Furthermore, we regret to see that incidents of torture continue to be reported, including through severe beatings and electric shocks. Therefore, we have two recommendations. 1. Ratify the second optional protocol to the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights, aiming at the abolition of the death penalty, and enact legislation abolishing the death penalty for all crimes and in all circumstances. 2. Ratify and implement the optional protocol to the Convention Against Torture and other cruel, inhuman or degrading treatment or punishment, and establish an independent, efficient and well-resourced national preventive mechanism with powers to conduct unimpeded visits to all places of detention. Croatia commends Laos for the progress achieved so far and wishes them a success.
Next speaker is Estonia.
Thank you, Mr. Vice President. Estonia welcomes the delegation of the Lao PDR. We commend Laos' commitment to eliminate violence against children and for its actions against gender-based violence. We encourage ensuring that women have access to good quality sexual and reproductive health care services, modern contraceptives and comprehensive sexual education. Estonia recommends Laos to ratify the second optional protocol to the ICCPR, to accede to the Rome Statute of the ICC and the Agreement on the Privileges and Immunities, to legalize abortion in cases of risk to the health of the pregnant woman, rape, incest or severe fetal impairment, and decriminalize abortion in all other cases, to adopt legislative measures to criminalize all forms of sexual abuse, violence, exploitation and sale of children, to reform criminal defamation legislation in conformity with the ICCPR Article 19, to guarantee unhindered and private access to domestic and foreign media information for all, both offline and online. Freedom of expression, including freedom of the media, are necessary components of democratic societies. We encourage Laos to uphold all international human rights standards and to review its laws and regulations that restrict the freedom of expression, in particular Article 65 of the Penal Media Act of 2008.
Thank you
and
very
Decree
much.
Number 3.
Next speaker is Ethiopia.
Thank you, Mr. Vice President. Ethiopia welcomes the delegation of Laos to this UPR session and thanks it for the presentation of its national report. Ethiopia congratulates the government of Laos in adopting the 10-year strategic development plan and the Vision 2030 that has an ambitious target of graduating Laos from the LDC status and become a self-reliant and an upper middle income country. In this clear vision, Ethiopia would like to seize this opportunity to wish you all the best and call upon the international community to play its role. We would also like to recognize Laos' significant leap in the field of gender equality, where in 2018 it stood 26 out of 149 countries. Ethiopia notes Laos' submission of 4 periodic reports under ICCPR, CEDAW, CRC and CRPD. Ethiopia wishes to make the following recommendation: to enhance its strategy of mitigating vulnerabilities against prolonged drought and floods through a robust climate resilience scheme. We wish Laos a successful review. I thank you very much, Mr. Vice President.
Thank you. Next speaker is Fiji.
Thank you, Mr. Vice President. Fiji welcomes the delegation of Lao People's Democratic Republic and congratulates the delegation for the achievements in the implementation of the recommendations from its previous cycle. Fiji offers the following recommendations. 1. Adopt a comprehensive, gender-responsive and disability-inclusive approach to climate change adaptation and mitigation policies, consistent with the UNFCCC and Sendai Framework for Disaster Risk Reduction, to address the economic, cultural and social impacts and challenges that climate change represents for the full and effective enjoyment of human rights for all. 2. Continue to strengthen national and sub-national resource allocations to develop and maintain an enabling environment for young people, women and men, and those living in remote areas to access quality sexual and reproductive health and family services. And 3. Continue efforts to develop a comprehensive child protection system with specific budget allocation, human resources, and adequate follow-up mechanisms to ensure the full and effective implementation of the Convention of the Rights of the Child. We wish the delegation every success in this review. I thank you, Mr. Vice President.
Thank you. Next speaker is Finland.
Mr. Vice President, Finland thanks the People's Democratic Republic of Laos for its national report. We wish to make the following 2 recommendations. First, Finland recommends Laos PDR to establish a national human rights institution in accordance with the Paris Principles. Second, Finland remains concerned on the disappearance of the civil society activist Sombat Somphone and recommends Laos PDR to ensure impartial and independent investigations and prosecution, as well as bring all perpetrators of enforced disappearances to justice. Finland wishes the Laos PDR successful review. I thank you.
Thank you. Next speaker is France.
Thank you, Vice President. I'd like to thank the delegation of Laos for the submission of their report. France has taken note of the efforts made by Laos PDR since the last review. However, the situation regarding human rights is of concern. France would make the following recommendations: that they officially set up a moratorium on the death penalty with a view to abolition of the death penalty and commute capital punishment into imprisonment. 2. Guarantee freedom of peaceful assembly, opinion expression, as well as freedom of the press by releasing all people who have been detained simply because they have exercised or defended the exercise of those rights. 3. Reform legislation in order to prohibit forced marriage and put an end to the impunity of perpetrators of violence against women and girls. And finally, ratify the Convention on Protecting Persons Against Enforced Disappearances, which was signed in 2008. We wish every success to Laos PDR during their review. Thank you.
Thank you. Next speaker is Georgia.
Thank you, Mr. Vice President. Georgia welcomes and thanks the delegation of the Lao PDR for the presentation of the national report. We positively note the continuing steps by the Lao PDR towards the implementation of the international human rights treaties, and Georgia notes with appreciation the measures taken by the government for the protection of children's rights and the adoption of national strategy and national plans of action in this regard, and encourage the government to proceed with the efforts in this direction. We welcome the Lao PDR's aspirations and steps aimed at reducing poverty and graduating from LDC status by 2024. With this, Georgia recommends to the Lao PDR to intensify efforts to combat human trafficking, especially of women and children, including by enhancing the work of the National Steering Committee on Anti-Human Trafficking, and to implement policies aimed at reducing high rates of child and maternal mortality. We wish the delegation of the Lao PDR a successful UPR. Thank you.
Thank you. Next speaker is Germany.
Mr. Vice President, Germany welcomes the progress Laos has made in implementing international human rights instruments and that Laos has repeatedly hosted UN Special Rapporteurs. Germany remains concerned about ongoing restrictions on freedom of expression, association and assembly. Germany recommends to 1. End the arbitrary arrests of individuals for exercising their right to freedom of opinion and expression, including of those who peacefully criticize the government, speak out about negative impacts of infrastructure or investment projects, or expose instances of corruption. 2. Conclude the process of ratification of the ICPD quickly and investigate all cases of enforced disappearances, including the case of Sombat Somphone and of Laotians abroad, and bring perpetrators to justice. 3. Establish a national human rights institution in accordance with the Paris Principles. 4. Ensure that the adoption and enforcement of laws, including the Land Law of 2019 and the implementation of policies in land management and use, are consultative, transparent and fully compliant with international human rights laws and standards. Thank you, Mr. Vice President.
Thank you. Next speaker is Honduras.
Vice President, the delegation of Honduras would like to welcome the distinguished delegation of Laos and thank them for their report. With a spirit of cooperation and a constructive approach, we would like to respectfully recommend the following. First of all, that you ratify the second optional protocol to the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights. 2, that you ratify the Convention on Elimination of All Forms of Discrimination against Women. 3, you ratify the optional protocol to the Convention Against Torture and Other Cruel, Inhuman, Degrading Treatment. 4, you ratify ILO Convention 169 on Indigenous and Tribal Peoples, dated 1989, and 5, you ratify the Rome Statute of the ICC. We congratulate you for the progress made and the results obtained in implementing those recommendations received in previous UPRs, particularly progress made by strengthening your legal and normative framework as regards the rights of the child. Our state also expresses its satisfaction for the measures adopted to increase access to education, improve literacy rates, as well as the enrollment of women and girls in educational establishments. We restate our support to all your actions in order to implement effectively the recommendations received here and also in previous reviews and cycles. Thank you.
Thank you. Next speaker is Iceland.
Thank you, Mr. Vice President. Iceland welcomes the delegation of Lao People's Democratic Republic. We welcome the national report and the steps outlined therein and hope for the continued implementation. We particularly welcome the recent reduction in the scope of the offences for which the death penalty may be imposed. Iceland makes the following recommendations. 1. Fully abolish the death penalty and to ratify the second optional protocol to the ICCPR. 2. To expand and accelerate implementation of existing frameworks in order to reduce the high rates of child marriage in rural areas. 3. To address barriers preventing women and girls to access sexual and reproductive health services as made available by the 2016 guidelines on the prevention of unsafe abortions. 4. Adopt comprehensive anti-discrimination legislation that addresses direct and indirect discrimination and encompasses all the prohibited grounds of discrimination, including sexual orientation and gender identity. I wish Lao all success for its review. I thank you.
Thank you very much. Next speaker is India.
Mr. President, India warmly welcomes the distinguished delegation of Lao PDR and thanks the delegation for presenting its national report. We commend the progress made by Lao PDR since its second UPR. While acknowledging the constraints and challenges Lao PDR faces due to its landlocked geography, historical burden of unexplored ordinances, we commend its achievements in meeting most of the SDGs. Particularly noteworthy is the significant reduction in poverty levels. We recommend the following to Lao PDR. Strengthen the national human rights mechanisms in compliance with Paris principles. Continue to reinforce efforts to support inclusive growth and prioritize budgetary allocations in primary education and in the reduction of malnutrition and maternal and infant mortality rates. Consolidate the progress made towards reaching the Sustainable Development Goals and in improvement of the human development indicators. We wish Lao PDR all the very best. Thank you, Mr. President.
Thank you very much. Next speaker is Indonesia.
My delegation welcomes the delegation of Lao PDR headed by His Excellency Bongkut Sam Songsak. We commend the progress made by Lao PDR since the last review cycle, including in the area of the economic, social and cultural rights. In this context, we emphasize the need for continued international cooperation for Lao to be successful in implementing relevant policy to reduce the poverty gap between urban and rural areas, as well as initiatives on equal opportunity for women. With such encouraging progress, Indonesia recommends the following. First, to continue implement poverty alleviation measures and investment in health and education sector, including by incorporating human rights knowledge in such measure, as well as in the education curricula in order to sensitize and increase nationwide awareness of human rights principle. Second, to further strengthen the capacity of public officials on human rights, including through collaboration with other states. Third, to strengthen efforts to eliminate human trafficking by enhancing awareness-raising campaign for the vulnerable groups in remote area. We wish Lao PDR a successful review. I thank you, Mr. President.
Thank you. Next speaker is Iran. Microphone, please.
Thank you, Mr. Vice President. Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. My delegations welcome the distinguished delegation of the People's Democratic Republic of Laos and the UPR session and thank them for presenting the national report. We appreciate the Lao efforts to promoting and protecting human rights cooperation in the country and its cooperation with the UPR mechanism. My delegation also commends the Lao government for accepting nearly 16% of the recommendation made to this country, including those provided by my government in the previous UPR period. I would like to make following recommendation to esteemed government of the Lao. One, to provide protection of the families as the natural unit and the most important foundation of the society in a more effective manner. Two, to enhance the efforts to reduce the rate of the maternal and the child mortality. Three, to make every effort to promote the right to development, which positively affect of the people's rights, in particular in economic and social areas. Finally, we wish the Lao People's Democratic Republic every success during this review. I thank you, Mr. Vice President.
Thank you very much. Next speaker is Iraq.
Thank you, Mr. Vice President. The delegation of Iraq welcomes the head and members of the delegation of Lao PDR. We welcome also the country's commitment to the presentation of national reports to treaty bodies, as well as to develop national plans to promote rule of law and good governance. We offer the following recommendations. First, accede to the International Convention on the Protection of All Persons Against Enforced Disappearances. Second, align national laws with the provision of CRC. We wish the delegation of Lao success in this UPR cycle, and thank you, Vice President.
Thank you very much. Next speaker is Ireland.
Thank you, Mr. Vice President. Ireland warmly welcomes the delegation of the Lao People's Democratic Republic. Ireland acknowledges the efforts of Lao PDR to advance human rights domestically and commends the progress made since the last UPR cycle. We welcome the adoption by the government of Lao PDR of the law of the treaties and international agreements in 2017. We encourage Lao PDR to take steps to further strengthen their national human rights framework by establishing an NHRI in line with the Paris principles. Ireland makes the following recommendations. 1. Refrain from initiating criminal proceedings against individuals for the peaceful exercise of their civil rights, including the right to privacy, freedom of expression, association and assembly, having regard to the importance of creating and maintaining a safe and enabling environment for journalists, human rights defenders and other civil society actors. 2. Enact legislation abolishing the death penalty for all crimes and in all circumstances following on from the 2018 revision of the Lao Penal Code, which reduces the scope of offences for which the death penalty may be imposed. We wish the Lao People's Democratic Republic every success with this UPR cycle. Thank you.
Thank you. Next speaker is Italy.
Thank you, Mr. Vice President. Italy welcomes the distinguished delegation of Lao PDR and appreciates the commitment to the UPR and the amendments to the Constitution in order to ensure a better protection of human rights. We also commend the adoption of the law on combating violence against women and children. Italy would like to offer the following recommendations. 1. Introduce a de jure moratorium on capital executions with a view to the complete abolition of the death penalty. 2. Take all necessary measures to put an end to child trafficking, including for the purposes of labor and sexual exploitation, as well as to all harmful practices against women and girls, including child, early and forced marriages. 3. Enhance freedom of expression, lifting restrictions for independent media and providing a safe environment for the work of journalists and human rights defenders. 4. Ratify the International Convention for the Protection of All Persons from Enforced Disappearance and initiate full and impartial investigations into allegations of enforced disappearance, torture, and other ill treatment. 5. Strengthen the independence of the judiciary and ensure full and effective access to judicial remedies to vulnerable people and minorities. We wish Lao PDR a successful review. Thank you, Mr. Vice President.
Thank you. Next speaker is Japan. You have the floor.
Thank you, Vice President. Japan warmly welcomes the delegation of Lao People's Democratic Republic. Japan appreciates the positive steps taken by Lao PDR to implement the UPR second cycle recommendations by adopting new laws and amending existing laws for improving human rights. We further appreciate the submission of 4 national reports to human rights treaty bodies and the acceptance of visits by 2 special rapporteurs. Japan would like to make the 3 recommendations. 1. Take further measures to raise awareness and understanding of human rights in Lao PDR. 2. Continue to increase access to health services and education among women and girls, in particular those living in rural and remote areas. And 3. In addition to considering early ratification of the ICPPED, continue to make efforts for addressing the case of the missing human rights defender. We wish the delegation of Lao PDR every success in the review. Thank you, Vice President.
Thank you. Next speaker is Jordan.
بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم. السيد نائب الرئيس يرحب وفد بلادي.
In the name of God, the merciful, the compassionate, we would like to say how much we welcome the participation of the high-level delegation headed by the head of the Commission. Thank you very much for this excellent report, which has been drawn up with stakeholders. We very much welcome the adoption by this country of about 42 new pieces of legislation since 2015. This testifies to their wish to improve human rights situation in the country. You've also adopted national strategies in order to improve the living standards of your multi-ethnic peoples. President, we would like to make the following recommendations: that you continue with your actions in order to cooperate with the international community in order to step up your capacities. Secondly, that you strengthen partnerships with regional international bodies which are responsible for education to ensure education for all and quality education. And finally, we wish every success to Lao PDR at the outcome of this review. Many thanks, Vice President.
Thank you very much. Next speaker is Kuwait.
Thank you, Mr. President. My delegation welcomes the delegation of Laos to this UPR session, and we thank it for its presentation and its report and the review. We commend the efforts deployed in the promotion and protection of human rights, as well as the implementation of accepted recommendations in the second UPR cycle. We also applaud steps undertaken by law, which include passing and amending laws, development of national plans, as well as reinforcing cooperation with the international community and international mechanisms in order to protect human rights and promote them. In this light, we would like to recommend to speed up efforts to achieve economic development in order to improve living standards of the people, particularly with regards to the provision of health care to those living in remote areas. In closing, we wish Laos success in this UPR, and thank you, Mr. President.
Thank you. Next speaker is Kyrgyzstan.
Thank you, Mr. Vice President. The Kyrgyz delegation welcomes the distinguished delegation of Laos PDR and thanks for the presentation of its national report today. We welcome the progress made in strengthening the legislative and policy frameworks in the field of children's rights. We commend the adoption of the National Strategic Plan on Reproductive Health Services for Mothers and Newborns and Child Health Care 2016-2025 and the National Plan of Action for Mothers and Children 2016-2020. In this regard, we would like to recommend the following. First, to extend public health system with a view to provide more basic health services to all and reduce child mortality. And second, to continue creating favorable conditions for ensuring access to free and quality primary and secondary education for all children. In conclusion, my delegation wishes success to Laos in its endeavors in the promotion and protection of human rights. I thank you.
Thank you very much. Next speaker is Latvia. You have the floor.
Thank you, Mr. Vice President. Latvia welcomes the delegation of Laos People's Democratic Republic. We note measures taken by the government in the field of promotion and protection of human rights in the previous review. Latvia welcomes information provided on Laos PDR's cooperation with the Human Rights Council Special Procedure Mandate holders. We remain concerned about continued restrictions on the freedom of expression. In this regard, we would like to recommend to the government to ensure the freedom of expression and media freedom by bringing national legislation into line with international standards. Latvia would also like to reiterate following recommendations from the previous cycle. Consider the extension of a standing invitation to all special procedure mandate holders of the Human Rights Council and accede to and fully align national legislation with all the obligations under the Rome Statute of the International Criminal Court. Latvia wishes to the delegation of Laos People's Democratic Republic a successful review. I thank you.
Thank you. Next speaker is Luxembourg.
Thank you, Vice President. Luxembourg would like to thank the Laos PDR for the presentation of its national report. Luxembourg welcomes its well-established bilateral partnership with Laos and commends the socioeconomic progress in the country since the last UPR. Luxembourg also encourages the Laotian authorities to ensure that national policies support equitable development across all of the country, placing particular attention on the most vulnerable groups. Luxembourg offers the following 5 recommendations. First, guaranteeing the effective exercising of freedom of expression by reforming legislation on the media, as well as legislation on fighting cybercrime. 2, guaranteeing that the freedom of expression can effectively be exercised, as well as the freedom to meet and freedom of association, reforming legislation so as not to hinder NGOs and human rights defenders. Third, to improve planning of development and investment projects, to prevent forced displacement and improve the movement and provide compensation for confiscated land. Fourth, to work towards the abolition of the death penalty.
Time is up. Next speaker is Malaysia.
Malaysia warmly welcomes the esteemed delegation of Laos PDR. Malaysia lauds Laos PDR for its commitment to develop and improve existing laws and policies to guarantee the rights of its people. As a fellow ASEAN member, Malaysia is appreciative of Laos PDR's contributions to the ASEAN community building and realization of the ASEAN Common Human Rights Agenda. Malaysia commends Laos PDR for implementing the accepted recommendations from its previous UPRs. In the context of the current review, Malaysia offers 3 recommendations which we believe would further complement the undertakings of Laos PDR in promoting its human rights and socio-economic developments. 1. Continue efforts to provide quality education for all. 2. continue its effective measures to improve women's access to health services, in particular reproductive health services, and 3, strengthen regional and international cooperation in the field of human rights. We wish Lao PDR a successful review. I thank you, Mr. Vice President.
Thank you. Next speaker is Maldives.
Thank you, Mr. Vice President. The Maldives warmly welcomes the high-level delegation of the Lao People's Democratic Republic to this third cycle review. The Maldives commends the government of Lao PDR for the measures taken to raise awareness on the country's constitution by facilitating the people of Lao easy access to legal information. In constructive spirit, the Maldives presents the following 2 recommendations to Lao PDR. 1. To review the government's economic strategy, taking necessary steps to conserve the environment by developing guidelines to conduct studies on the environmental impacts of foreign investment projects. 2. Establish an independent body to investigate deaths and enforce disappearances of the country and provide this body the investigative powers by law that are necessary to conduct free, independent and reliable investigations. We wish Lao PDR every success at this review. I thank you, Mr. Vice President.
Thank you. Next speaker is Malta.
President, Malta welcomes the delegation of the Lao People's Democratic Republic and thanks it for the presentation of its national report. We commend the progress that the state under review has achieved since its second review cycle and the implementation of the recommendations it received. We particularly welcome the state's cooperation with the UN treaty bodies and special procedures, the measures it instituted to improve freedom of expression and association, as well as its efforts aimed at safeguarding rights of women and family protection. In this context, Malta would like to make the following recommendations. 1. Consider abolishing the death penalty for all crimes in all circumstances. 2. Continue taking measures to improve investigations into cases of enforced disappearances. 3. Continue taking steps to improve the rights of LGBTI persons, particularly by identifying their needs, and consider involving LGBTI representatives in decision-making processes. We wish the delegation of the Lao People's Democratic Republic a successful review session. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I now give the floor to His Excellency Mr. Bungkat Sangsomsak and his delegation to address observations and comments that have been raised so far. Your Excellency, you have the floor.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you once again for giving the floor. But before giving the floor to my colleagues from Lao delegation, I would like to take this opportunity to express once again, Mr. President, yourself as excellent chairman conducting this meeting under very tight frame according to us. So please accept my appreciation to you. Now I give the floor to the Lao delegation as follows. On freedom expression, Ministry of Information. On independent judiciary, Ministry of High Court. On detention, I give the floor to Ministry of Public Security. On disappearance, it's going to be Ministry of Foreign Affairs, Mr. Pukong. And on death penalty, Ministry of Justice. So you respond one by one until we complete 6 speakers on the list. So the first speaker now is Ministry of Information. You have the floor, sir.
Mr. President, ladies and gentlemen, with your permission, allow me to provide some additional clarification on the freedom of expression of our citizens, as some concern was raised by some delegation as follows. The Lao PDR reiterates that the rights of freedom of expression of our citizens are guaranteed for by the Constitution and relating laws as explained in our national report for this third cycle. Of course, the enjoyment of such rights is subjected to certain boundaries, as Article 19 of the International Covenant of Civil and Political Rights has clearly prescribed that the freedom of expression must take into consideration the specific obligation and accountability. For instance, the freedom and reputation of others, national security, social morale, and public order. These values are protected in the relevant laws of the Lao PDR in line with the International Covenant of Civil and Political Rights. All violators of the law are subject to legal responsibility before the law. I thank you.
Next speaker from the High Court.
Mr. President, allow me to provide some additional information on the topic of on the independence of the court. We have conducted in accordance with the principles of justice and according to our Constitution, Article 94, and the law on the People's Court that prohibits all parties from interfering the affairs of the court as prescribed in Article 2 of the law on the courts. And during proceedings, we only use the law as the basis for deciding a case, meaning the law only, and the facts of the case are the only references that we use in deciding a court. And the judges are protected by the law against all threats and harms to their properties and well-beings and their families, as prescribed in Article 6 of the law on the People's Court. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Speaker from Public Security.
Mr. Chair, President, I cannot hear the speaker. In general, the Lao government has the sentences given are not for the purpose of punishing the prisoners. So on the realities and the actual capacities, the Lao PDR has emphasized on improving the conditions in the detention centers on a regular basis, aim at improving the living conditions of the prisoners as appropriate. And across the country, there are 18 detention centers, including 2 in the capital, which the government has allocated budgets for improving these detention centers. As reflected up to now, the government used more than $107 million to improve the infrastructure of the prison or detention centers and reduce the crowding in prison. And especially in 2019, we have completed the moving of a prison from the capital into a more spacious area and improve the conditions of the detention, the living conditions of the detainees. And in going forward, in addressing the overcrowding problem, the government of Lao PDR will continue to improve the prison conditions, and we will create regional prisons, and we will further emphasize on our humanitarian policies for the sentenced detainees, such as clothing, visiting, sports activities, handcrafts, and vocational training. And also on the special occasions of the country, the government also has the clemency and pardons policy according to the law. For example, since 2015 to 2018, the numbers of persons who have been granted clemency is 4,864, of whom 1,001 were women, and particularly in 2019, there were 1,042 prisoners being considered for clemency. And in 2018, the President issued clemency and reduce the death penalty to life imprisonment for 32 persons, of whom 2 were women. Thank you.
Next speaker from Ministry of Foreign Affairs, Mr. Pukong.
Mr. Chairman, distinguished delegates, I would like to provide additional clarification on the disappearance case of Sombat Sumpon. It has been raised by a number of delegations. As had mentioned by the head of the Lao delegation, the Lao PDR assures that it has not ceased its efforts to continue the ongoing investigation to bring the case into conclusion. And however, many questions remain unclear, and the investigation committee continues to look into all aspects that may be related to the case. The Lao government also reaffirms that the investigation has been conducted in a transparent, fair and just manner. The technique methods which have been employed by the investigation officers are also modern and matching international standards, and all investigation officers have the sufficient capacity that were deemed necessary for conducting their duties. However, the whereabouts and the truth could not still be concluded. While it must be acknowledged that out of the countless disappearance cases in the world, some are unresolved, some take a very long time to resolve, and some are simply cannot be broken through despite all the time and technology allocated. As such, the case of Sombat Sumpon, we think, would require more time for the investigation. And I would like to reiterate again the words of the head of the head of the Lao delegation. The government will continue to investigate. It will take all aspects to try to bring the case to the conclusion. Thank you.
The last speaker for this item is death penalty from the Ministry of Justice.
Mr. President, please allow me to further contribute to the issue of the death penalty as follows. Ladies and gentlemen, you have already read the report, and you have already news that Lao PDR have a great achievements on the reduction of the death penalty from 18 articles to 12 articles. This is, for us, it's quite, huge challenging. During discussion and elaboration of the Penal Code 2018, the National Assembly have raised the issue and debate about this abolition of the death penalty. And as a result, the special vote was called out for this subject. And as a result, it showed that the majority of the members of the National Assembly were of the view that they still need to maintain the death penalty with the new penal code and reserved exclusively for the most serious crimes. A decision to maintain the death penalty is not violation of the international human rights obligation, especially Article 6 of International Convention on the Civil Rights and Political Rights. I would like further to express that. Even though we maintain the death penalty in our new penal code, the court still decide on the most lifting sentence for the crimes committed. At the same time, the law also guarantees the impartiality, transparency, and the right of the accused in all trials, including those with the maximum sentence of the death penalty. Furthermore, those have been sentenced with the death penalty can also have the opportunity to file or to request for an appeal, clemency and pardons. Thank you.
Mr. President, we have exhausted the topic that we have to respond, so I give you back the microphone. Thank you, sir.
Thank you, Excellency. Thank you very much. We will now continue with our interactive dialogue. Next speaker on my list is Mexico. Mexico, you have the floor.
Gracias, señor.
Thank you, Vice President. We'd like to welcome the delegation of Lao PDR, and we'd like to thank them for the submission of their report. Mexico recognizes the efforts made to incorporate into their national legislation the provisions of international treaties, particularly the criminalization of torture, human trafficking, and reasons for discrimination. And also we'd encourage them to continue strengthening their legal framework. With a view to strengthening efforts to improve human rights, respectfully, we'd recommend the following. 1, that you establish a national human rights institution in line with the Paris Principles. 2, that you adopt legal administrative provisions for the issuance of birth certificates free of charge, as well as establishing civil registration offices in all districts, particularly focusing on the rural areas. 3, take necessary measures to prevent and combat discrimination and persecution against ethnic minorities and religious minorities, guaranteeing their right to freedom of expression and conscience, as well as access to health, education, and an appropriate standard of living. We wish every success to your country during this review. Thank you.
Thank you. Next speaker is Mongolia. You have the floor.
Mr. President, Mongolia is pleased to note that the Lao PDR has worked vigorously to create favorable legal conditions for the full enjoyment of civil, political, economic, social and cultural rights enshrined in its constitution and the international human rights instruments it has acceded to. We further note the strides the Lao government has made in ensuring gender equality, protecting the rights of women, children and persons with disabilities, reducing poverty and improving the country's healthcare and education system. Mongolia commends the Lao PDR on its regular human rights trainings for officials, in particular law enforcement officers from central to local levels and the general public. Such human rights education is absolutely essential. Otherwise, officials would be oblivious to the fact that their primary duty is to protect human rights rather than serve the abstract notion of state. We call on the Lao PDR to step up its efforts to ratify the International Convention for the Protection of all Persons from Enforced Disappearance and the Convention Against Discrimination in Education. And lastly, we call on the Lao PDR to accede to the optional protocol aimed at the abolition of the death penalty. Thank you.
Thank you. Next speaker is Montenegro. You have the floor.
Thank you, Mr. Vice President. Montenegro welcomes the distinguished delegation of the Lao People's Democratic Republic. We commend all the results that have been achieved in the promotion of human rights. We encourage the national authorities for the further engagement conscious of all objective difficulties, including the economic development, challenges related to rural and remote areas, contaminations with ERW and others. We note with appreciation the adoption of the National Action Plan of the Prevention and Elimination of Violence Against Women and Children. We welcome the significant progress that has been made concerning maternal and infant mortality. We encourage the government to provide equal access for women and men to HIV/AIDS prevention and adequate treatment resources, as well as free access to antiretroviral medicines for women and girls. We express concerns about the lack of the legal framework to define and criminalize all acts of enforced disappearance, the fact that the death penalty still exists, and the reports that victims of human rights violations who have limited education and were poor faced greater barriers in accessing the formal justice system. Montenegro recommends first to ratify the International Convention for the Protection of All Persons from Enforced Disappearance, second, issuing a standing invitation to all special procedures of the Human Rights Council. We wish the UPR cycle.
Time is up. Thank you. Next speaker is Morocco.
Monsieur le Président,
President, my delegation would like to warmly welcome the delegation from the Lao PDR. We thank them for the presentation of their national report under the third cycle of the UPR, which focuses mainly on the application of the 116 recommendations accepted in 2015. My delegation commends the government of Laos for progress achieved in protecting and promoting human rights, notably by the adoption of 42 new laws and the adoption by the National Assembly of a new legal and legislative reform plan for 2015 to 2020. Following also the recommendations of the previous cycle, my delegation hails the Lao PDR for transposing into domestic law provisions from international instruments to which it is a party. My delegation would like to propose the following recommendation: to continue efforts deployed in promoting the rule of law and good governance, notably strengthening the justice sector. Thank you, President.
Thank you. Next speaker is Myanmar.
Thank you, Mr. Vice President. My delegation welcomes the delegation of Lao PDR led by His Excellency Mr. Bongkep Samsonset and thanks them for the comprehensive national report. Myanmar commends the positive and firm measures taken by Lao PDR in implementing the recommendations made during the previous cycle of UPR. As development is one of the key foundations of the developing state, the achievements by the Laos in poverty alleviation and efforts for graduation from LDC status by 2024 are commendable. In the spirit of constructive engagement, Myanmar would like to make the following recommendation. 1. Continue its measures to implement the National Action Plan for Poverty Reduction in order to alleviate poverty and to improve the standards of living. 2. To continue its exerted efforts to empower women for more participation in all levels of decision-making. And 3. Further strengthen measures to ensure sufficient allocation of teachers and improvement of school facility in remote areas. As its close neighboring country and fellow ASEAN member, Myanmar wishes Lao PDR every success in this review. I thank you, Mr. Vice President.
Thank you. Next speaker is Nepal.
Thank you, Mr. Vice President. Nepal warmly welcomes the delegation of the Lao PDR to the third cycle of UPR process. We appreciate the continued cooperation and engagement of the Lao PDR with the UN human rights mechanisms for the promotion and protection of human rights. We welcome the adoption by the Lao PDR of the 10-year strategic development plan with the vision of graduating from the LDC status by 2024. We commend the efforts of the Lao PDR to promoting gender equality, women empowerment and improving maternal health care services. While wishing the Lao PDR a successful review, we recommend the following. 1. Make efforts to strengthen national human rights institutions in accordance with the Paris Principles. 2. Continue measures towards inclusive socio-economic development through investment in health and education sectors, including in the rural areas. I thank you, Mr. Vice President.
Thank you. Next speaker is Netherlands.
Thank you, Mr. Vice President. The Kingdom of the Netherlands thanks the delegation of Lao People's Democratic Republic for the presentation of its national report. We welcome the commitment of the government of Lao to bring its domestic legislation in line with its obligations under international human rights instruments. The Netherlands remains concerned about the restricted space for civil society in Lao and tight surveillance of activities by non-governmental organizations and government critics, both offline and online. We would like to recall Laos' commitment made during its last UPR to ratify and implement the International Convention for the Protection of All Persons from Enforced Disappearances. The Netherlands therefore recommends Lao to 1. Ensure the right to freedom of expression by repealing Article 56 of the Penal Code on acts of betrayal towards the nation and Article 65 of the Penal Code on propaganda against the state, in line with the ICCPR and the United Nations Declarations on Human Rights Defenders. 2. To ensure independent and impartial investigations into cases of enforced disappearances and hold perpetrators to account. The Netherlands wishes Lao success with the follow-up of all recommendations it received during the third UPR cycle. Thank you, Mr. Vice President.
Thank you very much. Next speaker is New Zealand. You have the floor.
Thank you, Mr. Vice President. New Zealand welcomes the participation of Lao People's Democratic Republic in this process. New Zealand notes positively that the death penalty has not been enforced in Lao PDR since 1989 and recommends that Lao PDR considers taking further action towards the abolition of the death penalty. New Zealand recommends that Lao PDR undertakes full independent investigations into all unresolved cases of alleged enforced disappearances, including that of Mr. Sombat Sompun. New Zealand further recommends that Lao PDR reviews and amends legislation and practices relating to freedom of expression and assembly to fully enable the function of non-governmental organizations and civil society. New Zealand commends improvements in the education of girls in Lao PDR and recommends further efforts towards addressing disparities in education. Thank you, Mr. Vice President.
Thank you very much. Next speaker is Nicaragua.
Gracias, señor presidente.
Thank you, Vice President. The Government of the Republic of Nicaragua extends greetings to the distinguished delegation of Lao PDR. We thank them for the presentation of their UPR, and in a constructive spirit we make the following recommendations. 1. That you continue with your hard work to mainstream the goals and indicators of the SDGs into your national plan. 2. We're happy to see the satisfactory progress you've made in reforming your legal and normative framework regarding the rights of the child, and we urge you to continue those efforts. 3. We also urge you to continue adopting effective measures to combat climate change. The delegation of the Permanent Mission of the Republic of Nicaragua to the United Nations wishes the Laos delegation every success in their UPR. Many thanks.
Thank you very much. Next speaker is Norway.
Thank you, Mr. Vice President. Norway welcomes the Lao PDR's participation in the UPR and notes the positive step to invite the UN Special Rapporteur on extreme poverty and human rights to visit the country. Norway recommends the Lao PDR to 1. Create and maintain a safe and enabling environment for human rights defenders and civil society to constructively contribute to policy making and national development. 2. Ensure that all women and girls have access to appropriate sexual and reproductive health services, and implement policies including awareness raising to prevent and respond to violence against women and girls. 3. Ensure that freedom of expression is safeguarded in all its forms. 4. Continue to take concrete action to address disparities in access to education, especially among rural ethnic groups, as a means to combat poverty, early marriage and human trafficking. 5. Develop a national action plan for full implementation of the UN Guiding Principles on Business and Human Rights. I thank you.
Thank you. Next speaker is Pakistan. You have the floor.
Mr. Vice President, Pakistan warmly welcomes the distinguished delegation of Laos People's Democratic Republic and thanks it for a comprehensive presentation of the national report. Pakistan appreciates Laos' efforts to ensure gender equality and health care, in particular for women and children. We specifically commend Laos for the adoption of a national plan on reproductive health services for mothers, newborns and child health care. Pakistan would like to make the following recommendation to the government of Laos People's Democratic Republic. Number 1, continue to take concrete measures to eliminate poverty and improve living standards for its people. Number 2, strengthen measures to further realize the right to education by providing adequate school facilities and teachers in remote areas. And number 3, continue its efforts to improve women in decision-making roles at all levels. We wish the delegation of Laos People's Democratic Republic a very successful review. I thank you, Mr. Vice President.
Thank you very much. Next speaker is Paraguay.
Paraguay extends a warm welcome to the delegation of Lao PDR, and we welcome the presentation of their report. Respectfully, we'd recommend the following: that you ratify the second optional protocol to the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights aimed at abolishing the death penalty, and this bearing in mind SDG 16. 2. You ratify ILO Convention 189 on domestic workers in order to make progress in SDG goals 5.4, 8 and 16. 3. That you implement programs and measures to put an end to early pregnancies and forced marriages and early marriages of girls in line with SDG 5, 3 and 5.4. 4. That you request cooperation from the Office to establish a standing permanent national mechanism for the implementation, reporting and follow-up of recommendations in the area of human rights within the framework of SDG 16 and 17. We welcome the efforts made to incorporate into your national legislation the provisions of international treaties to which you are a party. Also, the public policies implemented so far, particularly your National Action Plan for the Prevention and Elimination of Violence against Women and Children. We also welcome the cooperation shown with treaty bodies.
Thank you very much. Next speaker is Philippines.
Thank you, Mr. Vice President. The Philippines welcomes warmly the delegation of Lao PDR to this UPR session. My delegation welcomes the positive steps taken by the government to implement the UPR recommendations from the last cycle. We commend Lao PDR for the advances made in the area of development and poverty reduction, including on basic education and health care services. In a constructive spirit, the Philippines recommends the following: to further intensify its efforts on human rights education and capacity building for duty bearers and stakeholders. Number 2, to continue to enhance measures and programs to combat trafficking in persons, especially women and children. 3, to continue to implement measures to improve the political participation of women. And 4, take further steps to enhance the access of social services by vulnerable sectors, including women, children, older persons, persons with disabilities, among others. We wish our fellow ASEAN member Lao PDR every success in this review cycle. Thank you, Mr. Vice President.
Thank you very much. Next speaker is Poland.
Thank you, Vice President. Poland would like to thank the delegation of the Lao People's Democratic Republic for its national report and for active participation in the UPR process. Poland observes with appreciation the efforts to implement the recommendations made during the second UPR cycle, including efforts to improve the developed national laws and legislations in line with UN human rights standards. However, we are concerned about the situation of the human rights defenders, including detention and enforced disappearances, such as the case of disappearance of Sombat Sompone 7 years ago. We also note with concern the forced relocation of a number of local communities as a result of large development project investment. Therefore, Poland recommends to conduct thorough, independent and impartial investigation to clarify all unexplained and forced disappearances of human rights defenders in Laos, to ensure that population relocation as a result of land concession to development projects are carried out in accordance with relevant international standards, in particular the principle of non-discrimination and with adequate consultation and compensation, to adopt legal provision to criminalize all forms of sexual exploitation of children in compliance with international legal standards, specifically on sexual exploitation of children in prostitution, online sexual exploitation, in order to afford substantive protection to all children, including those belonging to ethnic minorities. Thank you.
Thank you. Next speaker is Portugal.
Thank you, Mr. Vice President. Portugal welcomes the delegation of Lao PDR and the country's efforts to implement the accepted UPR recommendations. We welcome the progress on the protection of the rights of the child and promotion of gender equality, as well as the 2 visits by UN special procedures. Portugal recommends that Lao PDR 1. Abolish the death penalty. 2. Prevent and combat arbitrary arrests, enforced disappearances, torture and other ill treatments, in particular against members of the Hmong community, initiate impartial and independent investigations of such acts, and ratify the UN Convention for the Protection of All Persons from Enforced Disappearances. 3. Scale up the investment and improve the availability and quality of services in rural and remote areas, in particular access to education and health, including sexual and reproductive health, addressing the specific needs and vulnerabilities of women, girls, and members of ethnic minorities. And 4. Prohibit child labor according to international norms and standards, including by setting the minimum age for employment at 14 years, without exception, and take specific measures to ensure and stimulate that all children, including girls, attend school, in particular in rural and remote areas. Thank you.
Thank you. Next speaker is Qatar.
Thank you, Mr. President. At the outset, we'd like to welcome the delegation of Lao PDR and thank them for the presentation of their report. We have taken note with appreciation of the policy and legislative measures taken to implement recommendations accepted in the previous UPR, as well as the 2015-2020 plan to amend legislation so as to incorporate ratified treaties, including human rights treaties. We have also taken note of the effort to strengthen existing national institutions and establish new machinery to comply with the country's treaty obligations. In order to support Laos' efforts to promote and protect human rights, we'd like to make the following recommendations. Continue to take necessary measures for all children to have equal access to quality education, especially those living in rural and remote areas. 2. To intensify efforts to enhance bilateral, regional and international cooperation to combat trafficking in persons, and finally to develop a national policy to enable people in rural areas to benefit from economic programs aimed at reducing poverty. Thank you.
Thank you. Next speaker is Republic of Korea.
Thank you, Mr. Vice President. The Republic of Korea extends a warm welcome to the delegation of Lao PDR to its 3rd cycle of the UPR. One of the recommendations Korea put forth in the second cycle concerned the elimination of all forms of discrimination against and ensuring greater empowerment, representation, and advancement of women. In this light, we are pleased to note the marked progress Lao PDR has made in recent years in the field of gender equality, as demonstrated by its Global Gender Gap Index, jumping from the world's 60th in 2013 to the 26th in 2018. We are also encouraged by the ongoing efforts in poverty reduction, judicial reforms, and improving access to health and education through the National Social Economic Development Plan and the Legal Sector Master Plan. In a constructive spirit, we offer the following recommendations today. 1. Consider establishing a national human rights institution fully compliant with the Paris Principles. 2. Continue the efforts to ensure the protection of women and children victims of trafficking, including by providing them with improved access to shelters. I thank you.
Thank you very much. Next speaker is Russian Federation. You have the floor.
Mr. President, we welcome the delegation from Laos and we thank them for the report. We support the efforts to implement the recommendations from the second round of the UPR. We note with satisfaction the reforms of the judicial and administrative systems as a part of the implementation of the general plan to ensure the rule of law by 2020. We recommend continuing to take targeted steps to improve national legislation, including observing human rights and freedoms. We would like to note particularly the active participation by Laos in regional cooperation in protecting human rights. We positively assess the results of the February 2016 session held in Vientiane and chaired by Laos of the 20th session of the Intergovernmental Commission of ASEAN on Human Rights. As a part of the recommendations from the second round of the UPR, we note major positive steps taken by Laos, protecting and promoting the rights of women, children, people with disabilities, the elderly, and other vulnerable population groups.
Thank you. Time is up. Next speaker is Senegal. Absent. We move to another the next speaker, Serbia. You have the floor.
Thank you, Mr. Vice President. The Republic of Serbia welcomes the delegation of Laos and thanks for the UPR national report presented. Serbia welcomes the effort invested and measures taken on improvement of the human rights in general. In particular, we commend the measures taken and on raising the awareness of the UN human rights standards and relevant training courses organized. In spirit of a constructive dialogue, we would like to recommend to Laos to ratify the Convention Against Discrimination in Education. We wish Laos a successful review process. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Next speaker is Singapore.
Singapore warmly welcomes the Laos delegation and acknowledges the government's efforts since its last review to promote and protect the rights of its people. We commend the Laos PDR's sustained efforts to provide for the education of children, in particular efforts to improve educational infrastructure in rural areas and to allocate 17% of its annual GDP to the education sector. Singapore recommends that to address the teachers' shortage, the government consider working where appropriate with bilateral partners and the relevant UN agencies such as UNICEF to attract and train volunteer teachers. We also commend the government's ongoing poverty reduction efforts, including the Poverty Reduction Fund Phase 3, which has decreased poverty in villages by 16.97%. Singapore recommends that the government continue to develop policies and legislation for inclusive growth and poverty reduction. Finally, Singapore remains concerned about the disappearance of Mr. Sombath Somphong since 2012 and urges the Lao government to seriously investigate and resolve the case in an expeditious manner and to bring much needed relief to Sombath's family. Singapore supports the Lao PDR's development goals and is committed to continuing our strong technical cooperation. As a close neighbour and fellow ASEAN member, Singapore wishes the Lao PDR every success in its efforts to achieve its Vision 2030 and graduate from LDC status in 2024. Thank you.
Thank you. Next speaker is Slovenia.
Thank you, Mr. Vice President. Slovenia thanks the distinguished delegation of Lao People's Democratic Republic for their presentation today and for their dedication to the UPR process. My delegation wishes to repeat the recommendation we made in the second cycle and recommend to consider acceding to or ratifying the second optional protocol to the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights, aiming at the abolition of the death penalty. Slovenia attaches great importance to human rights education and thus welcomes Laos' engagement in awareness raising and human rights training for state officials and general public. We took note that the Ministry of Foreign Affairs published a handbook on basic human rights information and distributed them to officials and law enforcement officers, members of the National Assembly, judicial officers, lawyers and law students. While we take note that over the last few years the Lao PDR has taken a number of steps to address the root causes of human trafficking, including awareness-raising campaigns and on the danger of human trafficking, we encourage Lao PDR to step up its efforts to investigate and punish individuals who exploited women and girls in prostitution and provide adequate assistance to them. I thank you.
Thank you. Next speaker is Solomon Islands.
Thank you, Mr. Vice President. Solomon Islands warmly welcome the delegation of Lao PDR and thank the delegation for the presentation of its national report. Solomon Islands congratulate Laos for the progress it made to address its human rights commitment. In constructive spirit, Solomon Islands make the following recommendations. 1. Review and amend Decree 315 to ensure that administrative procedures for religious groups are not arbitrary, vague, and discriminatory, and to eliminate the wide latitude local officials have to discriminate against and persecute religious minorities. 2. Allow all religious communities to meet and conduct activities freely regardless of whether they are incorporated or registered. 3. Introduce a mechanism to monitor and regulate local officials, especially in rural areas, to ensure they conform with human rights standards and do not arbitrarily and discriminatorily target Christians and other religious minorities. Solomon Islands wishes the delegation of Lao PDR a successful UPR.
Thank you very much. Next speaker is Spain.
Thank you, Vice President. Spain extends a warm welcome to the Lao PDR. We welcome their commitment and respectfully we make the following recommendations. 1. That you establish a unified national human rights institution with sufficient resources in line with the Paris Principles as part of progress made in order to strengthen the normative framework for the rights of the child. We recommend 2. That you approve an integral national strategy which has a specific budget line and appropriate oversight. 3. That you guarantee strict application of the law on family to prohibit early marriage and polygamy, particularly in the rural and ethnic communities. 4. Establish an official moratorium when it comes to the application of the death penalty as a first step to the definitive abolition of the death penalty, modifying the criminal code to reduce the number of offences for which one can impose the capital sentence. Given the increase of detentions and attacks against human rights defenders, you need to ensure freedom of movement as well as freedom of association and peaceful assembly. Many thanks.
Thank you. Next speaker is Sri Lanka.
Thank you, Mr. Vice President. Sri Lanka warmly welcomes the delegation of the Lao PDR and appreciates the detailed presentation made to the Council. Sri Lanka welcomes the amendments made to the Constitution of the Lao PDR since the last reporting cycle, which now stipulates that the state acknowledges, respects, protects and guarantees fundamental rights of citizens in accordance with the law. It is also encouraging to note that a number of new laws have been enacted that codifies the penal code, civil code, law on state compensation, law on treaties and international agreements, among others. It is noted that the Lao PDR has streamlined the provisions of the international treaties which it is party to, including human rights treaties, into its domestic law. We take note of the efforts taken to combat trafficking, including the implementation of the National Plan on Anti-Trafficking in Persons, Phase 2 for 2016-2020, with allocated national budget and assigning the National Steering Committee on Anti-Human Trafficking as the main implementing agency. In a constructive spirit, Sri Lanka recommends that the Lao PDR 1. Ratifies the International Convention on the Protection of the Rights of All Migrant Workers and Members of their Families. 2. Considers accession to the optional protocol on the Convention against torture and other cruel, inhuman or degrading treatment
Thank you very much. Time is up. Next speaker is Switzerland.
Monsieur le Vice President, Switzerland welcomes the delegation from Lao PDR. We're very concerned at reports of cases of enforced disappearances. We deplore the absence of progress on the case of Sombath Somphone. We recommend to the government that they ratify the International Convention against Enforced Disappearances and to ensure that it is implemented. Switzerland is concerned at restrictions on human rights in Laos, particularly right to freedom of expression, peaceful assembly and association. We recommend to the government that you put an end to the arrests of those people who are peacefully expressing their opinions. Switzerland would also recommend that Lao PDR manages as best they can any infrastructure project, including dams, and ensuring that they're safe in order to avoid enforced displacement, including the concerned communities in the decision-making process, and if there is an avoidable displacement, that you guarantee effective compensation and relocation programs in line with international standards. And finally, we welcome the report of the Special Rapporteur on Extreme Poverty and Human Rights, as well as efforts made to reduce poverty in the country. We encourage Lao PDR to draw inspiration from this. Thank you.
Thank you. Next speaker is Syrian Arab Republic. You have the floor.
سيد نائب الرئيس شكرا. يرحب وفد الجمهورية العربية السورية بوفد جمهورية لاو الديمقراطية الشعبية.
We would like to extend a warm welcome to Lao PDR, and we'd like to also thank them for submitting their national report. We also welcome efforts made as regards implementing the recommendations of the second cycle, namely improving living standards and the gradual improvement under their 10-year program regarding the 2016-2027, as well as your 5-year plan on economic progress. We recommend the following: strengthen your justice system, as well as those who enforce the law, as well as law students' capabilities. Strengthen social services, particularly in the far-flung regions, and improve your public health service in villages as well as your towns and cities. Every success.
Thank you very much. Next speaker is Thailand.
Vice President, Thailand welcomes the delegation of Lao PDR to the UPR. Thailand commends the progress made towards the Lao PDR's graduation for the LDC status by 2024. Thailand applauds the achievements promoting gender equality as reflected by the higher ranking of Lao PDR in the Global Gender Gap Index. Thailand commends the government's efforts that have contributed to the increase in the literacy and school enrollment rates. Thailand recommends the following. First, continue with efforts to further provide training and information on human rights standards to government officials and judges, as well as human rights education to business, students and the general public. Second, incorporate the rights of women, children, people with disabilities and other relevant groups into its 9th National Socio-Economic Development Plan, and consider taking integrated approaches in the implementation of the SDGs and human rights policies where applicable. As a neighboring country and fellow ASEAN member, Thailand is ready to cooperate closely and exchange lessons learned and good practice with the Lao PDR. We wish the Lao PDR every success in the UPR. Thank you.
Thank you. Next speaker is Timor-Leste.
Timor-Leste welcomed the delegation of the Laos People's Democratic Republic to the 3rd cycles of the Universal Periodic Review and congratulate the country on the comprehensive report presented. Timor-Leste welcomed the measure taken by Laos to increase access to education and improve illiteracy and enrollment rates among women and girls, which was reduced in the raising of the literacy rate to 85% in 2019. Furthermore, the delegation notes with appreciation the adoption of the National Action Plan on the prevention and elimination of violence against women and children for 2014 and 2020. Despite all of the progress made, Timor-Leste wishes to put the following recommendation to the delegation of Laos for each consideration. That Laos allocate financial and human resources to implement the National Plan of Action on Persons with Disability. That Laos increase in the effort to prevent child and sexual exploitation. That Laos adopts comprehensive strategy to eliminate discrimination against children and marginalized or vulnerable situations. We wish our good friend of Laos a successful review. I thank you, Mr. Vice President.
Thank you very much. Next speaker is Tunisia. You have the floor.
شكرا سيد نائب الرئيس. يرحب وفد بلادي.
Thank you, Vice President. My delegation would like to welcome the Lao delegation, whom we thank for the presentation of the national report. We appreciate the legislation adopted in order to improve the human rights situation, this through the ratification of a number of international conventions and the launching of new programs and adoption of national laws, such as the law on fighting gender-based violence. We present in a positive mode the following recommendations: to envisage the creation of an independent national human rights institution in line with the Paris principles. Second, to continue efforts to ensure gender equality and to build an environment that fosters the role of women. Third, to foster efforts to protect children from all forms of violence. We wish every success to Laos following this cycle. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Next speaker is Turkmenistan.
Thank you, Mr. Vice President. Extending our warm welcome to the distinguished delegation of Lao PDR at the UPR Working Group session, we thank for the comprehensive update to deliver today on human rights in Laos. We welcome ambitious objectives and efforts of the Laotian government to become an upper middle income country by 2030 through carrying out the state programs, including the Strategic Development Plan for 2016 and 2025, the Vision 2030, and 8th National Socio-Economic Development Plan. Acknowledging the adoption of the lawmaking and amending plan for 2015 and 2020 to integrate and implement the obligations and aspirations from the international treaties to which the Laos is party to. Along with that, we would like to submit the following recommendations. 1. To further continue its awareness raising and training activities on human rights for the state officials and the general public to raise the legal awareness across the country. 2. To strengthen its ongoing process to improve the justice sector, to build good governance and public administration through its legal sector master plan for rule of law for 2009 and 2020. In conclusion, Turkmenistan wishes the government of Lao PDR a successful UPR review at its third cycle. I thank you.
Thank you very much. Now I give the floor to His Excellency Mr. Bunket Sangsomsak and his delegation to address observations and comments that have been raised so far. Your Excellency, you have the floor.
Thank you, Mr. President, for giving me the second time. Now I would like to give the floor to 4 Lao speakers as follows. The first on CSO, Ministry of Foreign Affairs. Second speaker on National Human Rights Institution, Ministry of Foreign Affairs. The third, political role for women, for Women Federation. And the last one, land management for National Assembly. So you have the floor starting from CSO, Ministry of Foreign Affairs.
Thank you, Mr. President. With the permission of the head of the delegation, I'd like to respond to the concerns and suggestions made by few member states on the issue related to freedom of association. The Lao government has no restriction nor denies any right to establish or to join an association. As mentioned by our head of delegations, currently there are 163 associations and 25 foundations have been officially registered with Ministry of Home Affairs since the adoption of the Amendment Decree 238/PM. The adoption of the mentioned decree on association and foundations aim to make it clear on the role and responsibility of relevant authority and ministry of concern, which have the field of competence related to the activity or proposal of association to share the responsibility to implement activity or the work on the ground. It is to ensure that all activity conducted by NPA or CSOs in the countries are in line with national law and legislation, as well as to complement the government efforts in realizing our national socio-economic development plan and response to the real need of the people and the nations on the national social development efforts. In practice, since the new regulation or the degree has been adopted, some challenges does exist due to the limitation of understanding on the provision of the degree and the regulation related to or requirements for stipulation therein. That often denies, often delay the approval process by saying that the government understands that more work needs to be done. In reality, most of project and activity conducted by local NPA or CSO were funded by external sources. Therefore, Article 55 of the Decree 238/PM and its specific guidelines stipulated clearly that legislation NPA or CSO can receive financial or technical support from the individual or organizations. They must proceed accordingly to the provision of the said article and its specific guidelines. This is to ensure transparency and conformity with existing law and regulation. In this connection, Decree 238/PM amended in 2017 remain relevant and practical. I thank you, Mr. President.
Mr. President, I would like to inform you with regard to women participation in political and public life. In recent years, there has been an increase in the proportion of women in National Assembly and in the judiciary, and the continued commitment of the Lao government to increase women participation in political decision-making, as evident through a number of policy measures taken to encourage their participation. The strongest example of this is the fact that 27.5% of National Assembly members are women. According to the National Combined 8-9 Periodic Report on the implementation of CEDAW in the Laopedia, submitted to the CEDAW Committee in 2007, 10.7% of the cabinet ministers are female, 10.6% of deputy ministers are female, and 16.2% of director general are female, and 12.8% of the ambassador and consul general are female. The government goal was to have female at least 15% in such decision-making position and 30% of women in the National Assembly. The presence of women in the national level position, however, is not resulting in an increase in women in leadership at the province and local level. The government of the Laopedia maintained its commitment to increase women leadership and public participation under the NSEDP and reaffirmed its commitment to endorse and implement by 2025 a plan of action to promote women participation in political and public life in Laopedia as part of the 9th National Socio-Economic Development Plan. Thank you.
Mr. Vice President, I would like to address concern expressed by some delegates on land rights as follows. Land is under the ownership of the national community. Land rights is guaranteed by the Constitution and land law. The state ensures land use right by allocating land to individuals, organizations for use, transfer, and inheritance as provided by the law. The Laopedia pursues a policy of openness and market-oriented economy, promoting diversified investment in economic investment, while ensuring development of economy and the use of natural resources are sustainable, green-oriented, and must be complemented by social and environmental responsibility. In order to ensure development in this direction, Laopedia has adopted a number of legal instruments to ensure sustainable implementation of natural resource management and environmental management and public participation in development. It is important to note that the permission for land concession for development projects in the area of agriculture, industry, transportation, and other fields in the Laopedia requires environmental and social impact assessment in accordance with the law and standards. In the implementation process, committees represented by representatives from various organizations will be established to conduct environmental and social impact assessment, to seek public opinion and consultation with the people who may be affected through meetings at the village level, district level, and provincial level, and at all levels required. In order to ensure the transparency of the consultation process, in the case that it is required for relocation of people from the project area, the state provides new land area for resettlement and implements compensation policy based on the degree on compensation, with efforts to improve living conditions of the people, such as access to electricity, clean water, school, healthcare, employment, and other services. The established committee have also the role in monitoring the implementation of the project in each period. From 2015 to 2019, investment projects relating to land leasing and concession have been reviewed to ensure that the implementation of the project are in accordance with the laws and regulations of the Lao PDR. Thank you, sir.
Thank you, Mr. Vice President, to give me an opportunity to make comments on the issue of the independent national human rights institution as raised by some delegation as follows. During the past time, we have researched and studied the possibility of establishing a national mechanism or institution for protection and promotion of human rights that would be suited to the realities, conditions, and social demands of the country. The said organization would have the mandate to monitor the implementation of human rights as well as other obligations under treaties that the Lao PDR is party to. To this end, the Lao PDR has studied many models from other countries that have established their national human rights institutions. The result of the study concludes that with the current circumstances, there is a stronger need for us to further strengthen the legal framework and existing mechanism rather than creating a new one. The said mechanism includes in the Lao PDR the National Committee on Human Rights, the National Commission for the Advancement of Women, Mother and Children, and the National Committee for Elderly and Persons with Disability. Furthermore, we do have the law on complaint and petition that provide the rights for citizens and organizations to be able to file their complaint to the relevant organization to the purpose or request for remedy or any act of individual or decision made by a particular organization that might be deemed as a violation of law, injustice to the collective interest, to the state or group, or the rights of individual. The relevant organization here mean the government, the local authorities, investigation organization, the Office of People's Prosecutor, the People Court, as well as the Standing Committee of the National Assembly, all have the duty and bound by the law to inspect and provide remedy for complaint and petition from its citizen, legal person or organization. I thank you, Mr. Vice President.
Mr. President, I have exhausted my list speaker. I give back my microphone.
Thank you very much, Excellency. Now we will revert to the interactive dialogue. Next on the list is Ukraine. You have the floor.
Mr. Vice President, Ukraine thanks the delegation of Lao People's Democratic Republic for its detailed presentation of the national report. Ukraine recognizes steps taken by the government of Laos to ensure human rights of its citizens since the last UPR cycle. Yet, we are concerned over information about shrinking space for civil society in the country. In particular, the reports of restrictions of the rights to freedom of expression, assembly and association, as well as reported practice of arbitrary detention and incidents of torture. Ukraine recommends to Laos to 1. Ratifies the International Convention for the Protection of all persons from enforced disappearance without reservations. 2. Amend national legislation to ensure that it is fully consistent with Laos's international human rights obligations and, in particular, to provide for fair trials and freedom from torture and arbitrary detention. 3. Establish an independent national human rights institution in accordance with the Paris Principles. 4. Issue a standing invitation to all special procedures of the Human Rights Council. I thank you.
Thank you. Next speaker is United Kingdom of Great Britain and Northern Ireland. You have the floor.
Thank you, Mr. Vice President. The United Kingdom recognises progress in the Lao People's Democratic Republic, including on education and healthcare. The UK welcomes increasing infrastructure and development in Laos, but remains concerned about projects resulting in forced land appropriation. The UK also welcomes Laos' acceptance of recommendations that detained persons be treated humanely, but remains concerned that allegations of torture are common and not properly investigated. The UK is also concerned about restrictions on freedom of expression of foreign news agencies. We urge the government to promote and protect freedom of expression for all. We recommend 1. Develop and implement a national action plan on human trafficking and modern slavery, using this as a framework to evaluate progress on combating modern slavery and allocate funded budgets to the national action plan. 2. Repeal all legislation inhibiting freedom of opinion and expression that are not compatible with Article 19 of the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights. And 3. Undertake impartial, thorough and transparent investigations into all enforced disappearances, including Sombath, Somphone. Thank you.
Thank you. Next speaker is United States of America.
The United States welcomes the Lao delegation to the UPR Working Group. We recommend that Laos, 1, undertake domestic independent investigations into the disappearances and deaths of democracy and human rights activists. 2, amend Decree 238 and its associated amendments to align it with Laos's international human rights obligations and commitments, including by eliminating the following: burdensome registration requirements, arbitrary curtailment of activities and finances of associations, criminalization of unregistered associations and the government's harassment of their members, and the ability to arbitrarily dissolve non-profit associations without the right of appeal. 3, bring the criminal code in line with obligations under the ICCPR and immediately release individuals whose arrest and detention under these provisions restricted the legitimate exercise of their rights to freedom of opinion and expression. We remain deeply concerned about the human rights situation in Laos, particularly severe restrictions on fundamental freedoms that deprive the country's citizens of an opportunity to exercise basic rights and deprive the government of an opportunity to engage meaningfully with its citizenry. Thank you.
Thank you. Next speaker is Uruguay.
Muchas gracias. Thank you, Vice President. The State of Uruguay recognizes the efforts made by Laos in the area of the rights of the child by incorporating the provisions of the Convention of the Rights of the Child into your national legislation. In order to step up efforts in the area of human rights, we recommend the following. First of all, that you prohibit all form of corporal punishment on children in all settings. 2, that you enhance efforts to implement programs and policies to ensure that women and girls can have access throughout your territory to sexual and reproductive health services. 3, that you guarantee freedom of expression, freedom of the press, freedom of assembly and association, as well as the freedom of religion and belief, in line with the Covenant on Civil and Political Rights. Finally, Uruguay would also recommend 4, that you consider ratifying the Convention on the Protection of All Persons Against Enforced Disappearances, and 5thly, that you step up efforts to ratify the second optional protocol to the Covenant on Civil and Political Rights. We encourage Laos to continue with their reforms in order to ensure the protection of human rights for your entire population, particularly minorities, migrant population, as well as women, and we wish every success in your review. Thank you.
Thank you. Next speaker is Uzbekistan.
Благодарю, господин председатель.
Thank you, President. We have read carefully the national report of Laos under the UPR, and we also express our gratitude to the delegation for presenting it. We would like to welcome the ongoing processes of institutional, political and socio-economic reform in the country. This includes the most recent amendments to the Constitution, which greatly improve the protections and guarantees for the main rights and freedoms of citizens. We recommend, first, to continue to integrate international norms in the area of human rights into national legislation. Second, to ensure that the national targeted programs for development are effectively implemented to boost the living conditions of the population. In conclusion, we would like to wish every success to the government of Laos in protecting and promoting human rights. Thank you.
Thank you. Next speaker is Venezuela. You have the floor.
Thank you, President. We extend warm greetings to the distinguished delegation of Lao PDR. We appreciate the compliance given so far to UPR recommendations. We're happy to see the wise policies promoted by your government in the area of education, health and poverty reduction. Also, effective protection is being given to families, particularly the most vulnerable. The country attaches a great deal of importance to poverty reduction, the aim being to graduate from LDC status by 2024 and achieve the SDGs. By 2018, the poverty rate had dropped by 15.5% in certain districts. The following recommendations. 1. With the support of international cooperation, you could step up your wise efforts in investing in health, education and poverty reduction. 2. That you continue with ensuring full and free access to primary and secondary education for all children. And 3. Strengthen the national health system to reduce maternal and child mortality. We wish you every success in your UPR. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Next speaker is Vietnam.
President, Vietnam warmly welcomes the delegation of the Lao People's Democratic Republic and thanks it for the presentation of the national report. Vietnam takes a good note of Laos' strong efforts in improving its legislation and policies on human rights, including the adoption of 43 new laws and 31 amendments, and notably the law apps on mobile phones to facilitate the access to and the participation in drafting new laws. Vietnam also commends Laos for its impressive economic development and poverty reduction, which in turn could help raising the living standard of the Laos people and better ensuring their human rights. Vietnam recommends the following. 1. Continue efforts in socio-economic development and poverty eradication to further facilitate the enjoyment of human rights of its people. 2. Allocate adequate resources to provide affordable and quality basic medical services to its people. 3. Strengthen measures to further promote the right to education, especially to ensure sufficient teachers and school facilities in remote areas. As a close neighbor and fellow ASEAN member, Vietnam wishes Laos a successful review. I thank you, Mr. Vice President.
Thank you. Next speaker is Yemen.
Thank you, Mr. Vice President. We would like to welcome the head of the delegation of the Lao People's Democratic Republic, and we greatly appreciate their detailed presentation of the report, which mentions the progress achieved in the field of human rights. The government has dealt positively with these the provisions of treaty bodies and has thus amended its legislation to bring it in line with these treaties, including, of course, the Convention Against Torture, Trafficking, Discrimination based on ethnic origin, and discrimination against women as well as persons with disabilities. Laos has also taken measures to improve the situation of women and children. We commend Laos on its achievements and recommend that it continue to implement its development strategy in order to raise the living standards of its population and to provide it with the necessary services, especially in the rural areas. Finally, we wish Laos a successful review. Thank you.
Thank you. Next speaker is Zambia.
Thank you, Vice President. Zambia welcomes the delegation of the Lao PDR to the third cycle of the UPR working group and thank them for the comprehensive report and update provided. We commend the Lao PDR for having implemented 116 recommendations she supported during the second cycle. We welcome the adoption of the National Action Plan on the Prevention and Elimination of Violence Against Women and Children 2014-2020. In the spirit of a constructive dialogue, Zambia wishes to recommend to the Lao PDR the following. 1, to begin the process of establishing a national human rights institution fully compliant with the Paris principles. 2, to ensure that corporal punishment against children having rights was explicitly prohibited in the penal code. 3, to redouble the efforts to improve conditions of detention centers in accordance with the Convention, the Covenant and the United Nations Standard Minimum Rules for the treatment of prisoners. We wish the delegation of the Lao PDR a successful review. I thank you.
Thank you very much. Next speaker is Afghanistan. You have the floor.
Thank you, Mr. Vice President. Afghanistan warmly welcomes the distinguished delegation of Lao PDR to this meeting and thanks them for the presentation of their national report. We acknowledge the progress made in strengthening the legal and policy framework in support of the human rights and the significant progress in decreasing illiteracy and gender disparity. However, concern remains on issues such as pressure over the media and limitations on the practice of the rights to freedom of expression, association, and peaceful assembly. With the aim to further strengthen the protection and promotion of human rights in the country, we wish to make the following recommendations. 1. Consider establishing a national human rights institution fully compliant with Paris principles. 2. Redouble its efforts to reduce maternal mortality and implement programs aimed at reducing child mortality and morbidity. 3. Ensure that refugees and asylum seekers are protected and any attacks on them are subject to prompt, thorough and independent investigations. Finally, Afghanistan wishes to allow every success in the current cycle of the UPR. I thank you, Mr. Vice President.
Thank you. Next speaker is Algeria.
Vice President.
Thank you, Vice President. We would like to warmly welcome the delegation from Lao PDR and thank them for presenting their third national report under the UPR. My country welcomes the measures taken by the People's Democratic Republic of Lao to improve access to education and increase the literacy rate, as well as ensure schooling for women and girls. Algeria also commends progress achieved to strengthen the legal and political framework on the rights of the child and incorporating the provisions into national legislation from the International Convention on the Rights of the Child. We have the following recommendations. First, to effectively implement programs to reduce child mortality and morbidity levels, notably by boosting the qualifications of midwives and establishing quality standards for maternal and neonatal care. Second, to ensure that all girls and all women, in particular those living in rural and remote areas, have access to education, eliminating discriminatory stereotypes which hinder schooling for girls, and engaging in awareness raising for parents and local officials on the importance of education for women.
Time is up. Next speaker is Argentina.
We'd like to welcome the delegation of Lao PDR and we'd like to thank them for the presentation of their report. We'd congratulate Lao PDR for the cooperation that they have with the international community and with international organizations, Inter alia, OHCHR and its regional office, with a view to implementing those recommendations accepted in their prior UPR. Furthermore, the delegation of Argentina would like to make the following recommendations. 1. That they take the necessary measures to repeal the death penalty from their national legislation, and 2. That you adopt all measures to define the crime of enforced disappearance in your national legislation so as to be able to investigate and punish the perpetrators of such acts. Many thanks.
Thank you very much. Next speaker is Armenia. You have the floor.
Thank you, Mr. Vice President. Armenia welcomes the delegation of the Lao People's Democratic Republic to the UPR. We took note that the government declared its attachment and special attention to the promotion and protection of human rights of all the Lao people, since its national motto is to build a state that is of the people, by the people, and for the people. We were pleased to note that the government adopted National Strategic Plan on Reproductive Health, Services for Mothers and Newborns, and Child Health Care 2016-2025. We recommend it to continue with its efforts towards combating infant, child and maternal mortality and malnutrition rates. We also note of the work the Lao PDR has done in the direction of the adoption and implementation of the human rights treaties. We recommend and encourage it to continue it by ratification and implementation of the international human rights instruments in collaboration with OHCHR and other UN bodies. I thank you.
Thank you very much. Next speaker is Australia.
Thank you, Mr. Vice President. Australia recommends that Laos 1 amend laws that restrict freedom of expression, assembly and association to comply with international human rights law. 2. Facilitate a supportive environment to better enable civil society organisations to operate. 3. Conduct independent, impartial and transparent investigations into all alleged cases of enforced disappearance, including that of Sombat Sompon, ensuring family members are regularly informed of any progress. 4. Establish a formal moratorium on the death penalty with a view to ratifying the second optional protocol to the ICCPR. Australia commends Laos for its commitment to improving social and economic rights and for increasing engagement with the Human Rights Council Special Procedures Mandate holders. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Next speaker is Azerbaijan.
Mr. Vice President, Azerbaijan welcomes the delegation of the Laos PDR and thanks the delegation for the presentation of its national report today. We welcome the increased level of cooperation of the Laos PDR with the treaty bodies and special procedures of the United Nations. We take positive note of the measures taken by the government aimed at building enabling environment for enjoyment of all human rights. Azerbaijan offers the following recommendations to the Laos PDR. First, continue adopting and implementing national plans to empower women in all spheres of life. Second, take preventive and awareness-raising measures in order to further develop the fight against human trafficking. Third, continue implementing its poverty reduction efforts across all the country, in particular in rural areas. We wish the delegation of the Laos PDR a successful review. Thank you, Mr. Vice President.
Thank you. Next speaker is Bangladesh. You have the floor.
Thank you, Mr. Vice President. Bangladesh welcomes the distinguished delegation of Laos PDR to the third cycle of UPR. We take positive note of Laos PDR's initiatives to amend and adopt several laws and policies, particularly to amend the Constitution in order to respect, protect and guarantee the human rights. It is encouraging to see newly adopted first ever penal code, civil code, law on state compensation, law on treaties and international agreements. We appreciate continuing economic growth and recent uplifting of people's living conditions, accelerating the country's progress to graduation from LDC group by 2024. We applaud Laos PDR's submission of national reports on ICCPR, CEDAW, CRC and CAPD in recent years. Bangladesh recommends Laos PDR to continue efforts in international community support and assistance in promoting and protecting human rights, particularly the economic, social and cultural rights of its people. Continuous effort to eradicate poverty and promote access to education for all citizens. We wish to Laos PDR a successful review. Thank you.
Thank you. Next speaker is Belarus.
Thank you, Vice President. We welcome the Laos delegation and we thank them for presenting the national report. We note with satisfaction the long list of international commitments of the country in the area of human rights, a great deal of work done to improve legislation and ambitious plans for the future in this area, the adoption of a number of national strategies, including in sustainable development and the protection of motherhood and the rights of children. With respect to strengthening national mechanisms of human rights and activating and intensifying cooperation on international rights protection mechanisms, we would like to make the following recommendations: to increase future efforts to combat trafficking in persons, especially women and children, including by improving law enforcement practices with a view to bringing to justice and punishing the perpetrators, as well as by providing victims of trafficking with protection and rehabilitation. We wish them every success. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Next speaker is Belgium.
Thank you, Mr. Vice President. Belgium thanks the delegation of Laos for its presentation and commends the government for its cooperation with 2 UN special rapporteurs. My country is convinced, however, that more progress can be achieved in line with the core international human rights treaties. Belgium therefore recommends the government to 1. Ensure that any restrictions on the exercise of the freedom of expression and peaceful assembly comply with the requirements of Articles 19 and 21 of the ICCPR. 2. Ratify the International Convention for the Protection of All Persons from Enforced Disappearance and ensure its effective implementation. And lastly, as a strong opponent of the death penalty, Belgium recommends the government to ratify the second optional protocol to the Covenant on Civil and Political Rights, aiming at the abolition of the death penalty. Thank you, Mr. Vice President.
Thank you very much. Next speaker is Benin.
Merci, Monsieur.
Thank you, Vice President. The Benin Delegation would like to warmly welcome the delegation from the Lao PDR. We congratulate them upon the presentation of their third national report. We note with satisfaction that the country has adopted, since its last UPR cycle, a number of legislative and institutional reforms in favor of international instruments, notably in the area of human rights, such as the first criminal and civil codes, the law on compensation by the state, and the law on treaties and international agreements. We also welcome the adoption by that country during the last period of the National Strategy for Women and Children, the Plan of National Action for Women and Children, and the Plan of Action on the national level for the prevention and eradication of violence against women and children. We welcome the progress in the country, and we recommend continuing this activity and new initiatives for strengthening the Plan of Action for people with disabilities. We wish them every success. Thank you.
Thank you. Next speaker is Bhutan.
Thank you, Mr. Vice President. My delegation thanks the government of Laos for the comprehensive report on the implementation status of the recommendations from the second cycle. Adoption of as many as 42 new laws and amendment of existing laws, including constitution, is noteworthy, as is the effort in streamlining the domestic laws with the international treaties. We also commend Laos for raising awareness through distribution of brochures on human rights and for conducting training on human rights for the general public and state officials, including the law enforcement authorities, which would enable greater understanding and respect for human rights. We congratulate Laos for the excellent progress made in promoting and protecting the human rights of women and children, and therefore we recommend Laos to continue these measures of promoting and protecting rights of women and children, including raising awareness and training. Bhutan also recommends Laos to continue its poverty reduction efforts and effectively implement the poverty reduction plans and programs. Through these concerted development efforts, we wish Laos the very best in achieving LDC graduation soon. Thank you, Mr. Vice President.
Thank you. Next speaker is Brazil.
Thank you, Mr. Vice President. Brazil welcomes the delegation of Lao PDR to the third cycle of the UPR and presents the following two recommendations. One, to consider an official moratorium on the death penalty as a first step towards the abolition of capital punishment. And two, to consider ratifying the ILO Convention number 105 on the abolition of forced labor. Brazil takes note with appreciation the preliminary results from the National Plan of Action on Mothers and Children, especially regarding the enhanced birth registration and lower rates of mortality and malnutrition among children under 5 years old. We encourage Laos to continue to implement measures to reduce maternal mortality. We commend the country for the preparation of the new plan of action dedicated to people with disabilities and encourage investments in inclusive education. Brazil takes this opportunity to encourage Laos to also guarantee the free and full exercise of freedom of religion and to protect Christians against any form of persecution based on their religion, as well as to punish perpetrators. We share the views from the Lao PDR that the international cooperation can play a role in the implementation of voluntary human rights pledges and recommendations supported during UPR process. Thank you.
Thank you. Next speaker is Brunei Darussalam. You have the floor.
Mr. Vice President, Brunei Darussalam warmly welcomes the delegation of the Lao People's Democratic Republic to Geneva and thanks them for sharing the latest human rights situation in their country. Brunei Darussalam commends the government of Lao PDR's adoptions of the National Strategic Plan on Reproductive Health Services for Mothers and Newborns and Child Health Care and the National Plan of Action on Mothers and Children. Brunei Darussalam is pleased to note that Lao PDR has introduced a mandatory free education system up to lower secondary education. Brunei Darussalam further congratulates the Lao PDR government efforts in providing allowances to students from poor families. Therefore, Brunei Darussalam proposes two recommendations. One, to ensure the full and effective implementation of the National Strategic Plan on Reproductive Health Services for Mothers and Newborns and Child Health Care, and the National Plan of Action on Mothers and Children. And two, to continue efforts to promote and protect the rights of children to education. Mr. Vice President, Brunei Darussalam wishes our fellow member of ASEAN, Lao PDR, a successful conclusion to its third UPR session. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Next speaker is Bulgaria. You have the floor.
Thank you, Mr. Vice President. Bulgaria welcomes the delegation of Lao People's Democratic Republic. We appreciate the progress made by the state in strengthening the legal and policy framework related to children's and women's rights, and welcome the adoption of the National Strategy for Mothers and Children, as well as the establishment of the National Commission for the Advancement of Women, Mothers and Children. We also acknowledge that Laos has integrated the principle of the best interest of the child into laws in several key sectors, such as health, education and justice. We are of the view that more attention and further effort shall be exerted for strengthening of child protection, including protection of children at risk. Additional institutional and human resources for child care are needed, particularly for family support and community-based child protection services. Our recommendations: first, to take measures to further develop a comprehensive national policy and strategy for child protection with the aim to eliminate discrimination against children in marginalized or vulnerable situations, including girls. And second, consider developing an efficient system for identifying and addressing the individual support needs of children with disabilities. I thank you, Mr. Vice President.
Thank you. Next speaker is Cambodia.
Mr. Vice President, Cambodia would like to congratulate Lao PDO's substantial progress and achievements in its second UPR cycle. Cambodia applauds Laos' realization of an impressive economic growth and considerable improvement in the living condition of the people over the past 5 years. Cambodia welcomes the priority that Lao PDO attached to the adoption of legislations seeking to strengthen the anti-corruption endeavors. Cambodia commends Laos' extensive effort to engage in the ASEAN and UN human rights mechanism, as well as the UN special procedures, with a view to enhancing the promotion and protection of human rights. In a constructive spirit, Cambodia would like to put forward two recommendations. First, to intensify the ongoing effort toward inclusive economic growth, further poverty reduction, and increase investment in rural health care services. Second, enhance endeavor to increase women participation in public affairs and economic development. Finally, I wish the delegation allow PDO every success in this exercise. I thank you, Mr. Vice President.
Thank you. Next speaker is Canada.
Merci, Monsieur. Thank you, Vice President. Canada recognizes the positive engagement of the government of Laos with the UN mechanisms, particularly the completion of national reviews pursuant to the Convention on the Elimination of All Forms of Discrimination Against Women, also the Convention on the Rights of the Child, as well as the ICCPR. Canada would recommend that Lao PDR first of all, conducts credible and in-depth investigations into all alleged cases of enforced disappearance, including the disappearance of Sombath Somphone and other human rights defenders. Two, that you fully acquit yourself of the obligations incumbent on you pursuant to the ICCPR, namely respecting and guaranteeing freedom of the right to expression. Three, that you abolish the death penalty. And four, that you take measures to increase the representation of women in politics, particularly applying a 25% quota for the representation of women at all levels of government. Canada encourages the government to reconsider the burdensome administrative provisions of Decree 238, which limits civil society in the exercise of their activities. We wish every success to the delegation. Thank you.
Thank you. Next speaker is Chile. You have the floor.
Muchas gracias, señor.
Many thanks, Vice President. We'd like to thank the delegation of Lao GPR for the submission of their national report. We're happy to see the progress made since the previous UPR cycle, particularly the incorporation of this recognition to respect, promote and guarantee human rights in the 2015 Constitution. Also, we'd like to highlight the development of public policies such as your National Action Plan to prevent and eliminate violence against women and children. We'd also congratulate you on the ratification of the Convention Against Torture and other forms of cruel, inhuman, degrading treatment, as well as the Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities. In order to continue strengthening the promotion protection of human rights, we'd like to recommend the following. First of all, that you deploy efforts to establish a national human rights institution in line with the Paris Principles, and 2, that you establish legislation to effectively criminalize child marriage and adopt measures to eliminate such a practice. And 3, that you ratify the International Convention against Enforced Disappearances. We wish your country every success in implementation of this UPR cycle. Thank you.
Thank you. Next speaker is China. You have the floor.
Mr. Vice President, the Chinese delegation welcomes the high-level delegation from the Lao PDR to the UPR. We sincerely congratulate Laos on its remarkable achievements in the field of human rights. China commends Laos' energetic efforts to advance economic social development, to improve people's living standards, to promote poverty reduction, to develop education and health services, to protect the rights of women, children, and persons with disabilities, and to achieve ethnic harmony. China supports Laos' continued journey on a human rights path that is suitable to its national conditions. China has 3 recommendations to Laos. 1, to further continue economic and social development to reduce the number of people living in poverty. 2nd, to further develop education to strive for universal access to compulsory education. 3rd, to further develop health services, strengthen public health institutions. The Chinese delegation wishes the Lao PDR every success in the UPR. Thank you, Mr. Vice President.
Thank you. Next speaker is Egypt. You have the floor.
Mr. Vice President, the delegation of Egypt welcomes the delegation of Lao PDR, congratulates it on its national report and the establishment of a National Committee on the Empowerment of Women and Children and a National Committee on Persons with Disability and Older Persons, together with an Anti-Trafficking Committee. We took note of the efforts deployed by the government to promote the respect of the civil and political rights, freedoms of religion and faith, and elimination of racial discrimination. We offer the following recommendations. First, continue constructive cooperation with the treaty bodies of the Human Rights Council and the Special Procedures Regime. Second, pursue efforts to develop the health sector and comprehensive health care. In closing, we wish all the best for the country. Thank you, Mr. Vice President.
Thank you very much, ladies and gentlemen. This was the last speaker on our list. I now give the floor to His Excellency Mr. Bungket Sangsomsak and his delegation to address observations and comments and to make final remarks. Your Excellency.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. You will be the last row speaker for Laos. Now I give the floor to 3 speakers. The first on human trafficking for Ministry of Foreign Affairs, second on religion, Ministry of Home Affairs, and the last one, poverty reduction, Ministry of Agriculture. You have the floor, sir.
Thank you. I would like to respond to recommendation on trafficking in person issue that some countries have expressed their concerns. The Lao government acknowledged that human trafficking is a serious crime, a violation of fundamental rights and human dignity, especially against women and children. Therefore, the government attached importance in combating, preventing and suppressing human trafficking at national level, with focal emphasis on the victim-central approach in its protection and assistance efforts. In order to have a legal reference in implementing the said task, the National Assembly has adopted the law on anti-human trafficking in the year 2015 and the penal law in the year 2017, which has clearly stipulated the definition on human trafficking, which is in line with the protocol to prevent, suppress, and punish trafficking in person, especially women and children, supplementing to the United Nations Convention against Transnational Organized Crime and the ASEAN Convention against Trafficking in Person, especially women and children, all of which the Lao PDR is the party. The Lao PDR has completed the implementation of its phase of the National Action Plan on the anti-trafficking in person for the period of the year 2016 up to the year 2020, and is now the process of considering the third action plan for the year 2021 up to the year 2025 period. The new plan includes the further emphasis on the improving the policy, law and international cooperation, preventive measure, prosecution of the trafficker and victim rescue and assistance, as well as state budget allocation along with the international cooperation campaign for the anti-trafficking task. In the effort to tackle the root cause of the trafficking in person, the government has adopted the preventive and suppressive measures as the main approach, aimed at the raising awareness on the danger of human trafficking to the society, especially toward the women and children. Also create the better understanding on the risk of falling victim for the trafficking at the increase exponentially in the case of illegal migrant workers. The campaigns include the publicizing and the raising awareness on the population living in the border area and on the village considered as the high risk across the country. The publication include the various media such as the radio and the television broadcast, pamphlets, short film and drama and other participatory activities. Furthermore, training sessions were organized for the members of the mass media and the printing press in order to enhance the advertisement capacity and effectiveness in the disseminating on the danger of the human trafficking and how to cross the border safety legally. Thank you, Mr. President.
เรียนท่านรองประธานข้าพเจ้าขอมีความเห็นเพิ่มเติมต่อปัญหาการเชื่อถือศาสนาดังนี้โดยสืบต่ออ้างอิงเนื้อในของ
On religion and belief as follows. Pursuant to the national report, I would like to reiterate that Laos citizens without discrimination have freedom and religion or belief. The Constitution particularly guarantees the right to believe or not to believe in religion. The state has an obligation to respect the said rights of citizens and to protect the Buddhist activities as well as the activities of other religions that have been lawfully registered. In order to implement those provisions preventing individuals or groups from coercing, whether directly or indirectly, and prohibits all acts of division and discrimination among ethnic groups. And we have Decree 315 to protect religious activities, especially on equality and protection and promotion of religion in the Lao PDR. At the moment, the relevant sectors, for instance, the various organizations are further disseminating the decree for relevant officials from central to local level to ensure awareness and correct understanding and uniform implementation of the decree. Each dissemination campaign is participated representatives from religious leaders and a number of general public attendants. Thank you.
Mr. President, I would like to clarify furthermore on the poverty reduction, which is the priority of the national agenda of the Lao government. Eliminating own barrier to poverty reduction, the Lao PDR has translated SDG 1 into its national socio-economic development plan under the 2030 vision targeting that the mass poverty should be eradicated, people settlement stabilized and income secure, with accessibility to quality basic services, rural and urban gap reduced, assuring the sustainable rural development, paving the road to the gradual industrialization and modernization of the country. By 2020, the poverty rate should be reduced down to less than 10% and then 5% in 2025, accordingly to the national criteria. In this regard, concrete projects have been designed and the national criteria and indicator adopted from 2015 up to now. $420 million, including the government budget of 17% and the bank credit 50%, have been allocated to the poverty reduction project, most particularly in the remote rural area. The strong growth made the Lao PDR GNI per capita lift to $260 in 2018, and enabled it to move up to a lower middle income country. And two of the three criteria of pre-eligibility requirement for lifting from the LDC achieved. Significant progress in poverty reduction has also been made, most particularly during the last 3 years. 11,725 families have been climbed up from the poverty, reducing the poor family percentage down to less than 10% in 2018. And 215 villages out of poverty, with the poor village ratio of 18%. In the same year, 83.36% of the village enjoy the old railroad, and 93.39% of family the electricity. The microcredit services cover 85% of the village nationwide. In addition, the development project have contributed to the job creation and labor upscaling, paving the way for the short-term and long-term development and poverty eradication, and gradually narrowing the development gap between rural and urban areas. Mr. the President, to conclude, the Lao PDR government reaffirmed its target on achieving the SDG by extracting all its existing potential supported by the international assistance and the whole society participation toward keeping on eradicating poverty in a sustainable and inclusive way, graduating from the LDC status and striving for upper medium income country status by 2030. Thank you.
Mr. President, I have again exhausted my list speaker. I give you back my microphone. Yes, before concluding my remarks, Mr. Chairman, President, I want to present some other comments on two topics. First, on the rule of law. I think many colleagues from our table suggested that we should be a rule of law state very soon. But you know that the rule of law has been long processed since 18th century. Hopefully by 2020, Laos will become a rule of law state. But in other countries, they move forward already from the rule of law to become a rule of right. I hope that the existing rule of law state can move forward to become a rule of right that we can follow in the future. My second comment, Mr. President, is on CSO, on INGO. I heard many comments from the floor from member states that Laos haven't yet supported strongly CSO or INGO in the country. But I can clarify to you that there are three categories of INGO and CSO in Laos. The first category, INGO and CSO are close partners of economic development for the Lao government. They work with us hand by hand and they come up with a fruitful outcome. The second category of CSO, they behave themselves like secret, like not fully cooperate with the government. We call them a lonely rider. So I think this SEO should be encouraged to work with the government so they can get a full information, official information from the Lao government and from the other embassy in Laos, but not from the shadow report collecting from the rumor, from whatever they can call, it's not incorrect information. The third CSO NGO, they are not inside the country, they are outside the country. They cannot get any information from the report, the exact report from Laos. I think this one is not very, very fruitful and productive. I thank you, Mr. President.
I thank His Excellency and the delegation for the presentation and participation in this review. The report of the review will be prepared by the members of the Troika, namely the representatives of the Democratic Republic of the Congo, Indonesia, and Italy. In accordance with the procedure implemented in 2015, the recommendations section will be distributed on Thursday, 23rd of January at 6 p.m. for adoption on Friday, 24 January as from 3 p.m. The full report, including the summary section, will be circulated by email on Friday, 7 February 2020. I'll now return the floor to you, Your Excellency.
Sorry, Mr. President, I interrupt your statement. I thought that I should be the last speaker to express my comment to the meeting. Mr. President, our meeting come to an end. We spent 3 hours together and exchanged view on a very important issue. 96 member states have the floor, covering more than 120 topics and issues on human rights to Laos. So I would like to take this opportunity to express my deep thanks and appreciation to all member states sitting here today for giving us a directive, a guidance, recommendation, proposal, so Laos can improve its human rights in its country. I hope that your comments will be followed by our improvement in the next 5 years when we come back again in this meeting. And also I would like to commend Mr. Chairman for your very competent chairmanship, for your very strict control on the timing. I should learn from you how to control the timing of my delegation so we can maintain our tie correctly. Lastly, Mr. Chairman, once again, I appreciate all the comments from the floor, from members of the country, and from you staff here behind the scene that held us for this meeting. Once again, thank you. And please be reminded that you are my invitation to visit my country very soon. Thank you, sir.
Thank you, Mr. Minister. Thank you very much for your kind words of appreciation. This brings us to the end of our meeting. We will reconvene tomorrow morning at 9 a.m. for the review of Spain. Speaking time will be 1 minute for all. Inscribed speakers who wish to withdraw from the list are kindly invited to inform the Secretariat at the latest 30 minutes before the start of the review. Finally, all participants are invited to be in the room on time. I thank you very much. The meeting is closed.